back to Dr. Thiago.
All right. Hello. My name is Thiago Rachelson. I am a student at Morehouse College, and I'm teaching a class on the sociology of education. Today's lesson is going to be about inclusion, the aftermath of an independent school's inclusivity program. And again, I'd like to acknowledge my privilege and thank you to the Institute for allowing me to speak here today. So the objectives. Today we're going to learn a brief history of independent schools as well as my alma mater, comprehend the evolution of language policy around diversity and inclusion in independent schools, and lastly, understand the concept of ground theory in the context of my study. So let's do this interactive activity. If you ever had a year-long middle school or high school class centered around the following, place an M&M in the cup. Race, gender roles and gender identity, class, sexual orientation, ethics, cultural awareness, and learning characteristics. So who had a class on one of these topics? Who had a class on three? Three. So for one that had a class on this, on any of these topics, could somebody talk about what that meant? What were the benefits? What was the impact? Yes.
I had a class on ethics, but it was more medical-based and testing and research because I go to Tuskegee and that's where the syphilis trials happened. It didn't really have an impact on me personally because I already knew a lot of the information, but I can't speak to those who were in the class with me.
Okay. Yes.
So in high school, it was only a semester, I don't know if that counts, but I took a social movements course. It was like groundbreaking and progressive, but it was an interesting space because most of the people in the class were on the higher end of the socioeconomic scale and also white, so like there wasn't a lot of appreciation for what was being talked about, and it was also a lot of conflict.
Okay.
For like not a lot, for me personally, not it's a fact that happened. It's not really something to argue with, but there were a lot of arguments.
Now, for somebody that didn't have any of these topics in their high school or middle school, can you speak to what the detriment or the feeling about that? Yes.
So I feel like it just didn't give us a space. We weren't able to talk about any issues that our community faced throughout the whole of school. So we were just making spaces, like teachers felt the need to make a space within random classrooms, such as our math classroom was always one where we talked about issues such as what happened in Ferguson, Missouri, or our English class, and we would just take time out of class just to talk about it and sort of get our emotions into the air.
Mm. So one of the words that you said was space, and I feel like that is a huge part of my project, which I'll get into. And so independent schools, in terms of space, are historically exclusive. To define independent schools, it's a private school that's independent of any organization. It's not affiliated with a nonprofit or a church. It has its own board of trustees, which they decide what the vision and the curriculum for its students. And historically, these schools are for white affluent boys, as far as the colonial days. So the first time diversity and inclusion, so-called diversity and inclusion language policy was introduced was in the 1930s when they expanded the definition of diversity to mean socioeconomic differences. So these schools were racially homogenous, but socioeconomic, that was the only difference that they factored into diversity. In Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, a policy that was put in place to desegregate schools, even though it didn't really accomplish it as American history might oversimplify it as, that happened for public schools, but not private schools, because a lot of the white parents, they decided that because they didn't want to have their kid go to a school that was being integrated, they sent them to segregation academies, which is this photo up here. And these segregation academies were pervasive throughout the South. They were private schools, and they lasted well into the 1970s until this student, McCrary, actually sued his school, Runyon, because it was a private school, it was a formerly segregated academy, and he said that they didn't allow him to come because he was a black student. And so that's when they took it to court, and again, another policy took place which disallowed discrimination on the basis of race in independent schools. Whether or not that is actually being applied, that's up to debate. In the late 90s, schools thought about diversity more than race and ethnicity. They thought about diversity of thought. So this photo of the puzzle This incorporates all these things that go into the diversity of thought: thinking styles, language, perspectives, culture, experiences, gender. There's more than just the physical representation. But again, the schools, especially on their websites, including mine, talk about diversity and inclusion, but the action is not there. Instead, they have these hegemonic ideals, privilege, and silence that get in the way of it. I went to Palmer Trinity School, an independent school in Miami, Florida. It's very affluent, it's very white, and it also has this legacy of exclusion. And so I went there from grade 6 through 12, and from 6th through 8th, I don't remember having a single discussion on any of those topics in class. Maybe we read a book by a person of color, or watched a movie with somebody from the LGBT community, but never was a class centered around any of this. It wasn't until 2013 where the man on the left, Mr. Hood, a Morehouse man, was hired as director of diversity. And in 3 years, he built this program called Mosaic, which was an inclusion program. I think him, as well as a lot of different students and faculty who knew that there's exclusion going on, started fighting for the advocacy of this program. And so on the right is the Student Diversity Club, which was a huge part in maintaining this program. So my study is looking at this program and looking at what are the ramifications of this inclusive program and what are the students' experiences, what's the perspectives that they gave. The program is Mosaic. It's an inclusivity program that brings together students of all backgrounds, of all identities, and brings them into into classroom spaces to converse over a variety of topics. And these are facilitated by either students that are upper class students or teachers. And so in middle school, we talk about learning characteristics, digital citizenship, culture awareness, gender roles, and then high school, we move on to ethics, privilege, race, class, gender identity, sexual orientation, sexual identity, college preparation, global citizenship. And the mission is to promote the holistic safety of each individual through a series of planned lesson plans that are facilitated twice per month by faculty. So I would go to homeroom twice a month, and we would engage. At the time, I was in 10th grade when the program was being built, and we learned about privilege, race, class, gender identity, sexual identity. And I reached out to Mr. Hood for how he imagined diversity and inclusion, what his principles are for this. And so diversity is numbers and ratios, who's in the room. But inclusion is more important because it doesn't really matter the space. Any space can be diverse in some way, especially if you look at it from the perspective of the diversity of thought. But inclusion is what do we know about one another and how do we treat each other? Because if we don't know, we're not truly being inclusive. My study is analyzing the perspectives of students through a ground theory lens post-Mosaic. So ground theory is the attempt to derive theories from analysis of the patterns, themes, and common categories discovered in observational data. And so I reached out to a couple of my friends over the weekend, and that's definitely a privilege to have access to that. And I asked them this question: what impact did Mosaic have on you? So I asked this question because it could either be positive, neutral, negative impact. And their answers, there were emerging themes that resulted in this. And these themes become categories because as I got 5, and some of the themes were the same, some of the answers. And these themes become categories in this process of coding, which is compartmentalizing and sorting these into distinct, differing, and interrelating categories. And ground theory is cool because I can take these qualitative answers and then turn it into quantitative data. Because if this person says that they go with this theme, and then this person says they also go with that theme, but this person says they don't go with that theme, that's 2/3 say that they go with this theme. So now I'm looking at 66% of people feel this way. Alexa Garcia, can anybody read this quote? Volunteer? Yes.
I'm really grateful that Palmer incorporated Mosaic into its curriculum because it allowed me to learn about subjects not typically talked about in school and made me so much more open-minded and aware of what's going on in the world around me. Mosaic was especially important in an environment like Palmer's because the student body is made up of a lot of privileged kids who didn't realize the extent of their own privilege before the program. And even as a woman of color, Mosaic helped me realize my own privileges and taught me how to use them to help others.
Okay, so thank you for reading that. The theme that I saw here was the development of the sociological imagination, which is this idea in sociology of realizing yourself as an individual in the context of the world. And I thought that her going through this program and realizing that she was becoming more open-minded and placed herself in the world goes with this theme of development of sociological imagination. And this is a theme that emerges throughout this, and I believe it might be a common theme. 5. Thank you. All right, Henry. Can anybody read Henry's quote? Yes.
Mosaic was my first exposure to conversations about privilege, class, and gender orientation. These were issues my parents spoke about, issues that my friends and I often neglected to discuss outside of the classroom. Mosaic wasn't pivotal for me just because I took part in conversations about diversity then, but because I realized I wanted to continue having these types of conversations in the future. It helped me shape my college search process, as I wanted to go to a school that was passionate about these issues also, and was committed to continuing to grow and further understand the dimensions of human diversity.
Thank you. So the theme that I see here is this inspiration after exposure. So after being introduced to these topics that were rarely held in Henry's life, with the exception of his parents, he became inspired to learn more about this program. And whether or not he finds a school that does this, that's not exactly what my study's trying to prove, but it's really just making use of his interpretation of the program. Time check.
4 minutes, 3.5.
3.5.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to Fabi's. Can anybody read Fabi's? Yes.
Mosaic was the start of my social justice education. It created a space within an elite institution in which we could discuss topics outside of our usual sphere of privilege. While the sessions only scratched the surface, they provided essential introductions to new subjects and an avenue to explore social justice and begin my commitment to activism and equity.
Thank you. So this is part of the ground theory and coding coding process, because Fabi said that Mosaic helped her in her process of social justice and beginning that commitment to activism and equity. That is a theme that emerges that's similar to Henry's theme, but she differs because she believes that Mosaic only scratched the surface of topics. And so that's where they differ, but they still have interlocking categories. Anna is the same way. I'll just read this. She said that Mosaic didn't really teach her much about the topics they discussed, but it also taught her about accepting other people's opinions and directing a civilized conversation between people that disagree. Mosaic taught me a little more about patience and how to expand my ideas by introducing new perspectives. So she's actually similar to Fabi's because she didn't believe that she learned so much from Mosaic topic-wise, but what she learned was patience and through dialogue and with conversing with people that are different than her. And this is what I call empathy through conversation. So this goes back to the ground theory theme. There is themes and categories that are the same and themes that are different from one another, and that will help me in my study. So conclusion, the reason I'm doing this study is because making a myriad of these sentiments can put a mirror to the schools like Palmer Trinity to understand that they might have thought about diversity in this way, but it's not enough because the students feel this was lacking in the schools. And I also want to compare Palmer Trinity students to schools and students that they don't receive any of this instruction, to compare that and to advocate for diversity and inclusion officers at other schools here in Atlanta or back in Miami, where I'm from, to start the conversation and action for inclusive and diverse culture at their school. Thank you.
As ready as I'll ever be.
Alrighty, so now starting time for Professor Avant.
Hello. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Avant, and today I will be presenting on bodies of water, water as a metaphorical lens. So jumping right in, we're going to cover the objectives. Today we're going to discuss water as a metaphorical lens, try to establish that a little bit. Then we're going to explore the theories, the premier theory really, surrounding water, no pun intended. Then I'm going to explain to you a Black woman's water, establish that framework, and then we're going to put it to work. So without looking at your handout, can anybody tell me or answer this question? How does water act as a symbol in literature? Just quickly, like words that come to mind. Go ahead. Cleansing. Okay. Flowing. Mm-hmm. Lost. Redemption. Fluidity. Transport. Rebirth. Okay, rebirth, that's a good one. Baptism. Those are all really good examples. So on your handout, the first slide, point. So Viola Kapkova is kind of the person to consider when talking about water as a theory to apply to literature. But the way that she looks at water is as a birth, life, and rebirth cycle. In this example, she only really applies her lens to very Eurocentric Western novels or forms of literature. And the problem with that is that it negates a lot of narratives, people of marginalized groups, and like diversity in terms of literature. She also romanticizes water. She kind of ignores the way that it can be used as a force of destruction and as well as the power behind it, unless she's referencing it to a mythological figure like Athena or women such as those. Another problem with that, the romanticization of water, is that it perpetuates water as social and political capital. So those who have water maintain power in society. Because water is a life force, because it sustains life, those who have it are in power, right? We see that today. People at the top of the food chain usually have an abundance of whatever that resource is, and in this case, we're looking at water. Even though her examples are important, her references to white and European figures of power make it sort of problematic. So she kind of ignores marginalized groups. So with that in mind, I'm going to ask you to toggle a little bit to the part in your packet that has a Black woman's water. Can I see this? Thank you. So sorry, I'm just going to borrow this for a moment. So right here in the middle, this is basically a general definition, my definition of a Black woman's water. At the top, it says, water is to earth as a Black woman's water is to society. As water feeds the earth, as water puts nutrients into the earth, as water maintains life, a Black woman is the same thing to society. And in the hierarchical structure, we are at the bottom, unfortunately. It goes white men, white women, Black men, and then Black women. Without that foundation, there's nothing. With a faulty base, you have nothing. So right here in the middle, a Black woman's water is the embodied manifestation of systems of oppression and her experiences with trauma. This internal water acts in 4 ways. To me, it doesn't matter. To me, yeah, that's what it is. So it's blood, tears, sexual fluid, and sweat. So under blood, this manifests as physical abuse, menstruation, and menopause. Menopause is an interesting one because it acts as the lack of water, like her water is being taken away as her maturation process continues. Tears, this includes tears of joy, which is rarely seen in canonical African American texts. As well as a lack of tears, so a repression of emotion. A lot of the time, if we're not reacting very viscerally to external oppression, it's a repression of, oppression. It's a repression of our own emotions because we're not able to communicate our emotions because we're seen as like the matriarch, and we can't have that feeling because it's seen as a weakness. Another way that you can reference tears are in reference to sorrow, grief, pain, and mental illness, or like mental instability because of external oppression as well. Sexual fluid, that explores a Black woman's pursuit of sexual pleasure. Again, in canonical texts, we don't really see that very often. When a woman is exploring her sexuality, it's usually in reference to her use as mother or a person who can produce life. Again, as the matriarch, she is the creator of home and the creator of space for those people who live above her in the social hierarchy. This also includes amniotic fluid and vaginal discharge. Again, that goes with the maturation process of a woman. And then sweat. So I know it seems a little bit repetitive here, but so I have sweat as like a labor of love, labor of physical exertion, labor of birth, the literal birthing of another human being, and external forces like living in extreme environments and still expecting to do work. Sorry about that. Moving right along, we're gonna put it to work. You know, we're gonna use some examples. So there are 3 primary examples that I'm going to talk about today. The first is a short story. We're going to look at an excerpt from Sweat by Zora Neale Hurston, The God. The second, we're going to look at social media and how we can apply a black woman's water there and the thought-provoking thirst trap. And then the end, we're going to talk about Beyonce, because why not, right? Okay, so for this first part, there is on your handout, there is the actual excerpt as well as up here. Can I get any volunteers to read? Oh my gosh, Dawson, please take it away for us.
There's plenty of men that takes a wife like they do a joint of sugar cane. It's round, juicy, and sweet when they gets it, but they squeeze and grind, ring till they wring every drop of pleasure that's in them out. When they satisfied that they's run dry, they treats them just like they do a cane chew. They throws them away. They knows what they is doing while they at it and hates themselves for it, but they keeps on hanging after her till she's empty. Then they hate her for being a cane chew and in the way.
Yeah. So does anybody want to raise their hand and discuss how we can apply a black woman's water to this excerpt? And if you need any clarification, you can let me know now. Yeah.
He's basically talking about how like men will literally like wring the life of women out like water, and then like once they're all dried up, they'll just throw them away.
Yeah, definitely. Any other thoughts? Yes, Ebony.
When you mention the embodiment of the black woman's water, I can see that in each element that you discussed, because I see it in the sweat of the labor that she provides in the relationship, blood from physical abuse, perhaps menopause if she's aged, sexual fluid, which is quite obvious, and tears that are shed. So I see how each of those elements are.
Exactly. So I thought, did you want to share something? Yeah, go for it.
The cane chew, I feel it, because they're sucking the sweet part out, and what's left is the trash. So they're just throwing women away.
Most definitely. Yeah, right on the money. So that's exactly what it is. In this case, it's an example of all 4 elements of the black woman's water. Okay? Do we want to talk about this anymore? Do we need any more context on that, or are we all clear? Sweet. Okay, let's keep on going. So, sorry, I should have given like a precursor. So the next image is a little bit explicit. So if you don't like that, definitely close your eyes. But here it is. So this is Raquel. She is a woman who is kind of spearheading this new idea around the thirst trap. So if anybody doesn't know what a thirst trap is, it's defined here on the paper. But I'm not going to get into the definition because I feel like we kind of know. Right? We know what a thirst trap is. Some of us might like dabble in thirst traps, as you should. So here, excuse me, what's a thirst trap? So a thirst trap is, as explained here on the paper, it is the publishing of an image that is deemed as highly sexual or provocative to gain attention from your viewers, and usually like a sexual attraction type thing. But the reason why Raquel is so interesting is because, one, she uses her, actually, let me put it back on y'all. How does she use her water as a black woman to feed humanity in this case? This one's a little bit more nuanced, but I want to see how y'all's brains are working. Feel free to reference your little graph. Oh, yeah.
Okay, so I rock with Raquel, not only because she's my name twin, but also because she uses her platform on social media and role as a certified sex coach to educate her followers on like sexual health and also destigmatizing sexuality in general. So she's always talking about sex. She's like, we have sex, y'all. And her followers are like, yeah, we do. And so rather than shaming them, she tries to educate them on like being safe, and I think that's really important, while also having fun and encouraging more sexual fluidity.
Yeah, definitely. Ebony, did you have something to say?
No, I think Raquel put it really nice.
Okay, great. So in this case, I think another layer can be added to a Black woman's water. So if you think of like the body of a Black woman, I consider us, the process of using our water and giving output to the world, as I said we do, because a woman's water is to humanity as water is to the earth. I consider our bodies sort of a filtration process. So as we absorb the oppression that's put on us by society, we regenerate it and give it back out to society in different forms. So in this case, Raquel knows that her body is going to be sexualized. She knows that people are going to say this or think that about her form and what she's portraying on social media. However, she's using this as like not like a trap, but she's furthering the conversation around topics that are pretty nuanced and sometimes uncomfortable as a way to like get us talking. So as Raquel said, she talks about mental disorders, contraception, advocating for pleasure and the orgasm, erectile dysfunction, just a myriad of things which are all important and relevant in society. Yeah. Any questions on that one? No? Okay, sweet. So this one might be my favorite example for obvious reasons. So we're just gonna talk to Beyonce or just watch her do her thing. Ah, just kidding. Where's the sound? Yes? This? Okay. Okay. Okay.
Escape it and try it with the actual monitor. Like try it. I think it's
Okay. Oh, yes. Thank you. Ah, sorry. Sorry, if you weren't awake then, well, you are now. Okay, so let's get it started, right?
Closed my mouth more. Tried to be soft, prettier, less awake. Fasted for 60 days. Wore white. Abstained from mirrors. Abstained from sex. Slowly did not speak another word. In that time, my hair I grew past my ankles. I slept on a mat on the floor. I swallowed a sword. I levitated. Reached the basement. Confessed my sins and was baptized in a river. Got on my knees and said amen and said I mean. I whipped my own back and asked for dominion at your feet. I threw myself into a volcano. I drank the blood and drank the wine. I sat alone and begged and bent at the waist for God. I crossed myself and thought I saw the devil. I grew thickened skin on my feet. I bathed in bleach and plugged my menses with pages from the holy book, but still inside me, coiled deep, was the need to know. Are you cheating on me? Are you cheating on me?
Right, legend, okay? Legendary. So how can we apply a Black woman's water to this example? Yes.
Well, there was a lot of talk of purity.
Yeah.
I feel like it was either correlated to, like a Black woman's water was correlated to purity, or like, or it was like maybe correlated to like dirtiness.
Okay.
And she was trying to.
Yeah.
I see the labor from both of these individuals, Raquel Savage and Beyonce knows, because, well, in both of them, they're like, they're, to me, in conversation about patriarchy and the violences of how patriarchy specifically affects Black women.
Most definitely.
So that's my.
Yeah, for sure. Yes, Kathy.
Like Langston was saying, a lot of the ways that she tries to cleanse herself is through water. Like she says, baptized in a river, a volcano. She drank the blood, she drank the wine, and she gave the bleach. And those are all like liquids.
Yes, yes, definitely. So what's interesting about this example is that it bridges both Kapkova's idea of water and my own. So she speaks about like her own purification process internally, trying to rid herself of the impurities that were in her environment due to her marriage, but also gain back some of the water that he took from her. So that was an interesting, comparison, but also she's immersed in water. So then that brings in like the birth and the rebirth. And then when she's stepping out and the water's coming, she's like, here I am, brand new, hello. So that's that on that. I wish I had more time, but there's always next class. So, all right, thank you.
Greetings, you all, and welcome to a preview of English 361, which is Trap God, the formation of Black masculinities via Atlanta trap culture, music, and media. So just to get started, I want to tell you guys a little bit about my theoretical framework and my methodology. I'm a definite believer that education and my methodology should be a collaborative effort. So if ever you have any questions or any input, feel free to raise your hand. This is a safe space. If you need any clarity or clarifying questions, feel free to ask me. So today we will identify complexities of masculinities, plural, interesting. Explore regional influences on identity performance, and we're gonna apply some literary analysis to the Atlanta trap music and film phenomenon that's going on. So question to consider. What is masculinity? So I want to have some working definitions and kind of a framework that we're going to use for the rest of the semester. So I kind of want to build some definitions with you all and just to have even ground for where we're going to go for the rest of the semester. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a viewing activity. So one thing that's very important to me, this is an English course, but there are a plethora of texts to be analyzed. And so in this class, we're going to be analyzing music as well as film. So we're going to start off with the first episode of Atlanta. The episode is going to be entitled The Big Bang. And I just want you guys to pay attention to the characters in this show. The characters in the show, what's going on. I want you to free write and just write your initial responses, any memories, anything that's going on in your mind, go ahead and have that. Let's see. All right, y'all. Initial reactions. Let's get a working definition of masculinity. What's some initial reaction? Anaya.
Flexing unnecessarily.
Flexing unnecessarily. Okay. That's a characteristic of what was going on with these men here. Do we agree? Okay. We're gonna put flexing on the board.
Okay.
All right, you guys can just speak. Langston.
Disrespecting women.
Disrespecting women.
Disregard for property.
Okay. we can just use disrespect. Okay. Okay. Tiago.
It's defined by what it's not, which is feminine.
I like that. Okay.
Acting tough.
Acting tough. Tough. Okay. Any more feedback? Any more initial reactions? Asia, what's up?
Violence.
Violence. That's a big one. Okay. Let's go.
I like what you said in the beginning about like masculinities, like
Plural.
because I think they were all like performing masculinity in like different ways.
Different ways. Okay.
So it kind of shows, like you were saying in the beginning, like diversity and masculinity.
I like that.
I've been thinking.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was thinking about that, and I kept thinking about the gas station as a very masculine space, or like very threatful. That I think shows a lot of, or like encompasses different kinds of masculinity going in and out, and like flexing the cars, the gas, buying cigarettes, buying alcohol.
So can we all agree as a group that spaces can be deemed masculine? Can you agree with that? Okay. Public spaces? I think that's important to put just by itself. Okay.
I'm thinking about power, but specifically in like the economic market, because
Okay.
it's like, dude, I'm not gonna replace your mirror, your paperboy, you're rich. And
Right.
instead of being like, actually, I'm kind of broke, there's just this weird sign.
So there's a little bit of humor incorporated with that as well. So I think it's important to look at masculinities as a scope, as something that is complex. It's not just one stagnant thing. And so you may be wondering, how are we going to apply this to the rest of the trap phenomenon? There's so much going on. And it seems like it's just toxic masculinity, but there's so much more going on. So we're going to work through that in this class. And our first case study, our first sample, is going to be none other than the iconic Gucci Mane. So what we're going to do, I'm going to play 2 of his songs, just quick little snippets. So I want you guys to pay attention to how the quality of the music sounds, what he's saying, and how there's a little bit of a transformation. And then we'll go into the physical transformation of Gucci Mane and how that applies to trap. Y'all heard that? You want me running back? Good? You heard it? Birds in the living room, like Atlanta Zoo. Okay, that's from 2009. This is for Gucci. That was before Gucci Mane was actually in prison. So now I'm gonna play something from his most recent album, which is called Delusions of Grandeur, which was recently released. And I want some of your opinions afterward. That's the only snippet you guys need. Okay, let's get back into this presentation. We're going to talk about a few things. So, let's talk about some physical changes with Gucci Mane. This is Gucci Mane in around 2009. This is him in 2019, all right? You guys noticing anything? A clone, right? So we have this concept of the clone of Gucci Mane. Can you kind of expound about that? Why does he seem like a clone?
Well, like, he's acting totally different. Everyone on social media was like, we have never seen Gucci act like this. First of all, physically, he looks a little different. People were pointing out the fact that his tattoo on his face was just either like not there or faded. So, I don't know. I think I'm just messing around, but I'm also very interested in like this shift in his identity post-prison.
Right, okay. Let's go. Okay. You can, this speak as it comes.
I see the difference between post-prison and after, okay, the latest one, 2019, and also goes with with his lyrics when you look at the picture side to side. Like he doesn't have those jewelries that he has in the left-hand side picture, and then as it says in the lyrics, I don't need the diamonds. Just he's living his word.
Okay, Asia.
But to my homegirl Ray's point, I think like what's replaced the diamonds is his physical presence. Because now like he's always shirtless, like he's always a very masculine person in space. So I guess like now he doesn't have so much of a marking manhood, but it's more of a physically imposing presence.
So the way that he's performing his manhood is transforming, right? Okay, Langston.
I just think like, unfortunately, like prison time serves as its own type of jewelry within that Black community, and I think that like he's wearing his prison time as something that speaks for itself, as opposed to before like he would adorn himself with things. Now he's literally saying like, no, like now this is just something that you can see. I don't even have to physically present any type of way.
That's wonderful input. Caleb.
Gucci used to be fat.
Gucci was.
I'm guessing he had to bulk up to save himself in prison. But yeah, just like what y'all are saying, prison is like, people will be like, I went to the penitentiary for 3 years, and look at me now, like you can't step to me anymore. So yeah, that too, and his smile is like.
He smiles. Gucci smiles now, right?
Look at them teeth.
Yeah. Anaya.
Also, like in the way that the music is like portrayed. In the first example, it's kind of muddled. Like all the sounds are kind of joined to become one like haze. And then his lyrics are different, and like the way that he speaks is different as well. But then in the other one, it's very clean, it's very precise. You can understand what he's saying. I think that stands as well as like. You can apply that to his mental space, perhaps. Like at the beginning, maybe he was a little vulnerable, maybe he didn't really know what he was doing with his life. But then after, not to say that prison saves people because we can't even get into prisons because why? But afterwards, he has like a firmer stance on like himself and like where he is in life and where his feet are. So I think that's reflected in his music.
Agreed. Okay, so we're gonna take these last two comments.
Okay, so for the lyrics, I feel like it's a big change going from like analogies or metaphors, because you started off 2009 with Gorilla Goons, and we know you're not talking about real gorillas. We talking about like big men, right? And then you go over here and you're just like, I don't need diamonds. That's very straightforward to the point as to the first time we had to really think about what he was saying, because I know that song and I was just like, you know how many times I played that song? Like,
It's really interesting.
and I think that goes with like masculinity, how men grow up, and some of that stuff kind of like fall off naturally. Like I don't have to do this. I'm a grown man. That was boy times, right?
So with maturation comes transformation. Okay, Cassandra.
Me personally, I'm just kind of like struggling to like put this prison into like a masculine sense. Mostly because like to me, what I'm seeing like with this transformation is something that like I see with people back home that I know, like they like you go to prison and you come out with like this sort of like enlightened mentality, and it's not necessarily like wearing prison as like a badge of courage. It's kind of like what I was doing in the past was stupid. I don't need to do that.
So this growth, like a growth of maturation. I get what you're saying. That's what you're saying. So I think that's something we can take from this, specifically with the case study of Gucci Mane in particular, is that there can be regional and time-specific interpretations of masculinity, and the interpretations of manhood can change with maturation. I think we're all in accord with that and how that reflects. But what we're interested in this class is considering how does that reflect with trap music. And I feel that Gucci Mane is a perfect reflection of the evolution of trap music and the way that trap music is going. As you guys may know, if you turn on the radio, you can turn on a country radio station and you'll hear trap music and its influence. So it's obvious that there's being a commercialization and a commodification of trap music within popular media. And that goes into this last point. Can someone read this quote for me? Asia, go ahead.
If a man does not have the sauce, then he's lost. But the same man can be lost in the sauce.
Thank you for that. That was by none other than Gucci Mane. And I just want to leave you guys with a call to action. So we know from these examples that masculinity is not one stagnant, one-dimensional aspect. There are many different ways that it can be interpreted, and it is always evolving. So we can get lost in the sauce. We can get lost in the one dimensionality of this concept of masculinity and what it is, Or we can do as we aim to do in this class and explore the complexities of the sauce, because we're not getting lost in the sauce. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. How are y'all? How's this? Almost noon, almost lunchtime, so I'll try to be as best as possible. Well, welcome to Intro to Cautionary Analytics. And hopefully by the end of this session, you and I will have a great understanding what that means. Today's class, we're going to put on the persona as we are anthropologists and historians, right? And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you a symbol, which is already on the board. And I'm going to ask you to create a narrative, to describe to me what you see, and tell me what type of document it is, all right? That sounds good? Yes. Does that make sense? Yes. Great. All right. So like I said, y'all all anthropologists. You were engaged with this, or someone gave you this symbol. It was like, we found this somewhere. We want you to analyze it, tell me a story about it. What is this thing, right? And so what I like to do over the people next to you, you have a question? Oh. We'd like to do people next to you just like for a minute or two, try to describe what you see in the picture, if you can see it. Hopefully I can see it. Yeah. Oh, yeah. All right, a couple more seconds, 20 seconds. All right, let's reconvene. So I'm curious, what do you see? Just descriptions. Go ahead.
So we had some varying descriptions, but we saw like two structures. On the right-hand side, and then I saw a fire on the left side. My partner saw a portal.
Portal.
Yes. And then we saw some trees as well. That was,
A bush,
yeah. Sunlight maybe from the top. Clouds. Outdoors.
Go ahead.
We think the round boy right there is a mythical creature coming out of a fire.
You said round boy?
Yeah, he has eyes, so I'm like, it's not a rock, it's a round.
Anything else, Tiara?
Yeah,
Campfire, and like tents, and like the sun, and like some birds chirping, and like
We see a person.
Aaron is B-O-I. Round boy. Yeah, not gender, it's just like addition.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. All right. So based off the terms and what you've discussed with your partners, someone try to create a narrative for me. So like a story. What do you think is actually happening? Go ahead.
All right, so just the way that the stick figure is drawn, or I'm gonna call it a stick figure at least, it makes me feel like it's performing some sort of action. The fact that it's near fire makes me feel like it's a ritualistic action. Or it could be cooking, because I don't know, I called the ball a pot. And it's near homes, or they could be doing a rain dance, it's possibly raining.
Okay.
There's a lot.
So which one of those things do you think most fit the symbol?
I'm gonna say the ritual.
Okay. And you said for water? Like water dancing or?
Just like whatever ritual.
Okay. Anyone else? More of a sentence. Go ahead.
I think that this is like a snippet of what someone has seen. So approaching this camp, not camp, but space community, and seeing a member of the community like going through actions that they do on the day-to-day basis. And that's like subjective. However you want to see that action is up to you.
Does this fit what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. Last one.
I see an encounter with the forest spirit. So like the round thing is like the forest spirit and there are trees and it's in nature. Scene. So probably something that's not human, meaning something that's not human, basically.
Beautiful. So which one of these three do you think is most likely to be what's going on?
The second one.
Okay. Approaching the community. All right, so this is the narrative we're going to go with, right? And so you see all these different structures, fire, portals, trees, and you also see that person approaching a community, perhaps doing a ritual practice. So what type of document would you say this is? Picture? Anything else? Drawing. Okay.
A quilt, perhaps? Oh, yeah.
Picture, drawing,
Or like a cave. Yeah, I thought maybe carving.
carving. All great answers. So the second part of this hypothetical situation, let's say this is actually a symbol or artifact from like Wakanda, right? I am part of the Wakanda people, and I've come to you because after all this narrative you made, you named it a document, you say it's a picture or carving, and you have these different terms that you use to describe this. You have now you have made your tenure book, right, about this particular civilization, and now this civilization has a history that you authored, right? Right? So y'all are great anthropologists in the field, and you are being approached by me to say, hey, it's Wakanda, we have this wonderful time machine, and we would like you to be the first person to actually experience and engage with this community. Why not? You are the expert, right? You are the person who said that this image is a person approaching community, perhaps doing a ritual practice, and said it's a picture and not carving, right? And so how do you think that piece of information will interact? So for example, when you go there, what do you think you're going to see?
I think I'm going to see probably structures like that and people of like whatever time period I'm traveling to.
Mm-hmm.
They might look like the clothes was probably going to be a little bit different than today's standards.
Naya?
I'm going,
Oh, you can go.
I'm going to respect what I wrote about because I think that I'm an expert. So when I go to this community, I'm going to expect to see like people just doing their thing. You feel me?
Right. Okay. So when you actually go in actuality, you see none of these things. You don't see any structures, no fires, no portal trees, round boy. You don't see any of these things, right? Because the purpose of this exercise is to show how we force, when we experience things, when we see things, we force our own legible metrics and forms of communication upon it, right? And what I mean by that is that when we look at this, some of y'all said this was a structure, right? You see this was a person. You said this was sunlight. But in reality, there's no actual way to know what this is. So, for example, all this is unknown. All this unknown things. But what we do, we literally interpret it and add our own meaning into things. All right? So the way this relates to a lot of my research is that what does interpretation do outside of add our own meaning into things, right? And based off this exercise, I'm curious, what do y'all have any thoughts about that? Vanessa?
I feel like you can silence the real narrative and promote our own narrative.
So you're saying there's a loss in narration, right?
They can over-glorify something. So there could be like this, in actuality, it would be like a toy carving, but people would be like, oh, this is a god that they worship and they had in all the houses.
Over-glorify, I hear loss. And this is the second theme of my research is about, what do we do with this? What do we do with the loss, right? Because when we interpret or translate, we think, well, we're just making a comparable meaning, right? But as we notice, right, in this particular situation, we're only imposing or projecting our own value system and knowledge systems upon this thing. So do you have any ideas? What do we do with loss? How does this function? What is it? How do we engage this? Kamaria?
I would say like we either ignore the loss or like condemn it. So I think about like when missionaries, right? And they condemned everything that was there. So what we lost was like a real value of those cultures, and now we don't know what those are. So you kind of can't go back once you have a narrative built.
I think that's a beautiful point. And it goes to my next one, right? So what do we do in academic spaces? We are going to academia, and we call this thing, this narrative, this picture, all these different structures or terms, we call it knowledge. So how can we call something knowledge when in reality we're just projecting our own current knowledge systems upon these cultural groups, right? And so this is what I am trying to bring into academia, right? Having this lens of understanding how interpretation can lead to a certain loss, and that loss can lead to a knowledge that continues to reinforce this loss, right? Because my work particularly works with a theorist or a Nigerian gender scholar, wrong thing. In her work called Invention of Women. Right. And in it, she talks about how historians, when they refer to Africa, or particularly Yoruba land, which is the place to incite a lot of her research, they place everything in this binary of man and woman, right? And however, her purpose of her book is to try to trace how, through her language, she traces how those categories did not exist prior to the engagement with the British colonizers, right? And so through that really sparked in me like, perhaps there's something about interpretation that we should be more cautious with. Perhaps we should be more hesitant before we just immediately interpret or immediately translate. Because as you see in the situation here and also Oluwumi's work, that there's always a loss. And what we do with that loss and how we categorize loss really determines the knowledge. And if this knowledge continues to be predicated on a loss, how can we ever say we know anything about the particular group that we're describing? And that's all for today's class, y'all. See y'all next time.
So good afternoon, everybody. I got a few questions, just a few questions. Anybody love food? Anybody consider themselves a certified foodie? Yes. Me too. So I got a question for a few people if you want to answer. What type of food did you grow up on? Like, was it home-cooked meals? Was it fast food, dine in, dine out? What did you grow up on? Yes.
I grew up on home-cooked, for sure.
Okay. Yes, you.
A mixture. I feel like, depending on which household I was in. Yeah.
Okay.
At my grandma's house or with my mom.
Okay. Yes, Kawana.
I went out a lot, so I grew up on chicken nuggets, guys.
Okay.
Home cooked, but really unhealthy.
Okay. Aiden.
I grew up on home-cooked seafood from Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Okay.
And a little bit of fast food here and there.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay. Yes, Vanessa.
Home-cooked Mexican food all day, every day.
Okay. Rhea.
Home cooked, like we rarely got takeaways.
Okay. Okay, cool. I can agree with majority of you guys. I also grew up on home-cooked meals, all right? So my name is Dr. Tiara Clark, and my presentation will be over food justice, understanding food apartheid, all right? So it's just the outline. First, we're gonna explain, I guess, why we're not using food deserts anymore, but then understand why we are using food apartheid now, and then going more in depth into what food apartheid really is. We'll be analyzing 2 maps, and then we'll be finishing it with food justice. So I have another question, all right? When you hear the word desert, what do you think about? Anaya?
A lack of water.
Lack of water, me too. Kayla?
Barren, dry and barren.
Okay. Langston? Fruitlessness. Okay, yes. Isolation, okay. Okay, Cassandra?
Sparseness.
Okay, sparseness. Okay, I like those. I really do like those. All right, so
first of all, I agree with all of you. Food desert, when I hear the term food desert, I feel like there's no food anywhere because it's dry, there's nothing, right? But the actual definition of food deserts is, food deserts are defined as communities with limited access to healthy food, but the overabundance of fast food restaurants, liquor stores, and convenience stores. So me, when I hear food desert, I feel like that term is a bit misleading considering with the going along with the definition. Also, food deserts is kind of like saying, okay, this place, this community lacks healthy resources, right? But they have fast food restaurants, liquor stores, convenience stores, right? But it doesn't really address the real problem of food insecurity, right? So scholars in my field have used the new term food apartheid. And so before we discuss food apartheid, I feel like we need to understand the word apartheid fully. We don't want to go into something not really understanding, right? So apartheid means apartness in Afrikaans. I hope I'm saying that right. So in South African history, apartheid is a system of racial segregation and discrimination sanctioned by law. Food apartheid is defined as a human-created system of segregation based on race and class that relegates certain groups of food opulence and prevents others from accessing life-giving nourishment. And this is by Leah Pittman in her book, Farming While Black, okay? The one thing that we really need to distinct when we're talking about food apartheid is that this wasn't a law, unlike apartheid in South Africa. Okay, there's no law in the U.S. that says, okay, these groups are segregated based on the type of foods or the type of resources that they're going to get, okay? Similar to apartheid in South Africa, food apartheid negatively affects people of color in low-income communities and are oftentimes less likely to receive affordable and nutritious food options compared to their white counterparts. So understanding food apartheid a bit more, when you talk about food apartheid, you address the economic inequalities and structural racism in the food industry. This is why we don't want to use the term food desert, because in a way, it's just putting a Band-Aid on the problem. It's not addressing the entire system, okay? So the term food desert does not adequately address the issues of systematic racism and classism in the national food system. And this next quote is from, I know the little Spelman Knights gonna shout and do, you know, they're gonna do what they do. This quote is from Dr. Ashante Reese in her new book, Black Food Geographies. And I feel like she just explains this so well. She says, the historical and ongoing significance of race at the intersections of capitalist accumulation, dispossession, and residential segregation requires an understanding of how the geographic distribution of food is a reflection on anti-blackness and oppression as much as it is about class and economic capital. Okay, so get your papers out, please. All right, so we'll be doing a little activity, which I think will be kind of fun. Was fun to me. And and basically, I guess let me just tell you what the two maps, right? So there's two maps on the front and two maps on the back. Okay, so the first map on the front is North Dallas, right? So these two maps are taken from two different cities and, well, not really cities, two different areas in Dallas, Texas, because you know I'm from Dallas, right? So I just want you guys to like really analyze the map with the people around you. Please talk about it and just pay close attention to the types of stores and restaurants and their names because that's very important. So I'll give you guys a few minutes to really like look at the map. So yeah. Oh, that's a good question. I'm sorry, class. I'm sorry. I should have, I guess, explained a bit further. I only want you to look at the first side, the only North Dallas. Yeah. Yeah. Hey, how's it going, everybody? All right. Everybody good? Yeah. Okay. So, what did y'all see? Yes, Tiara.
One of the first things I noticed with this North Dallas grocery stores map was that there were like 2 Whole Foods. It just seemed close.
Right.
A Trader Joe's too. Then a gourmet shop. Then like I don't know. It just seems. And there's a lot of things like upscale and organic.
Okay. Sorry.
Me?
Yes. I'm sorry.
Even with the fast food restaurants, they're not like the worst type of fast food. Like there's In-N-Out, Whataburger, Shake Shack, and one Wendy's, which is like bad, but not the worst that you can get.
Okay, yeah, Raquel.
Yes, to Anaya's point, there was no McDonald's in
Yeah.
North Dallas. And that's how you know you in a food apartheid area, I assume, when you see a McDonald's or multiple ones, because it just shows that this is like the cheapest quality and fastest quality of meat and food that these people can get. So that was the first thing I noticed.
Okay, Bear.
These 2 maps looks a whole lot like the difference between like where I live in Jersey, where Princeton, where it's all the wealthy, like Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, all that stuff, right next to each other, and then Trenton, which is where I live, with a more impoverished area, which is just like convenience stores and fast food restaurants.
Okay. Yeah, Cassandra.
I was looking at like the map itself, I guess, more of. So
Okay.
like I'm noticing that with the fast food restaurants, they're all kind of concentrated in one general area. And I know like with the neighborhoods that I'm familiar with, like that's generally how they are. Like there's developments and like suburbs, and then like you go towards the highway and there's all of the in one area. But the grocery stores are also kind of concentrated when you really look at it. They all kind of run along the main veins of the highway system. So like this kind of put me on to the fact that it's probably like a higher class area.
Okay. So just taking an educated guess, what do you think the social class and racial makeup of this area is? Just an educated guess. Upper middle class, white. Okay. Well, so I have some results, and can I get a drum roll, please? Bada bang! Can somebody read the results? Yes, Langston.
So race and ethnicity, Black and African Americans make up about 7% of the area. Latinx people make 10%, and white people make up a whopping 78%.
Do y'all see that income?
Yeah.
Sheesh. Okay. Yeah, so are you guys surprised by this? No. Not really? Okay, I agree. Okay, so I actually have another one on the back. If you flip over to the back, I want you guys to do the exact same thing. Okay. Hey, everybody. Let's come back. So what type of stores did y'all see in this area? Burger King. McDonald's. Ford McDonald's. Church's Chicken.
A lot of discount marks.
Yes. Okay. So given the two maps, what do you think? Just taking an educated guess, what do you think the social class and racial makeup of this area is? Looking at the stores. That's a little hint. Yeah, Asia.
I'm thinking working to middle class and racial makeup. I'm imagining Black Americans and a lot of Latinx folks.
Okay. Yes, Anastasia.
So in my history with specifically like the supermercado and like the Oriental stores in which is not a great term, but in Jackson where I live, generally the Hispanic people stay in direct proximity to like
Hispanic-owned businesses or businesses that specifically cater to Hispanics. So they're probably going to be by the El Rancho and the Fiesta Marts, and also like the Asian people normally stay by like the Oriental stores, as they are called.
Okay. Okay. Anybody else? Yes, Cassandra.
Also, just like the highway system, whereas before it was kind of like through the map, now it's around the map, and that's usually what they did to like communities of color when these highways were built. And even if you look at like the roads, they're a lot more like metric, so that lets you know it's probably closer to like the city.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, let's see the results. Another drum roll, please. Bada boom. Anybody want to read the results? I can read them. I can read them. All right, so the Latinx community is taking it at 63%, the white community 22%, and the Black and African American community at 7%. And the median household income is $52,000 per year, which is quite interesting because that's less than half of the other area. So, it's important to note that North Dallas and Oak Cliff is only like 30 minutes away, including traffic. So, mind-blowing, right? So to wrap all this up, it's important to understand that this is only one example of food inequality and food apartheid. Many more examples exist all over the country. So thank you, guys.
Thank you so much. So good afternoon, class. My name is Caridad Cruz Rodriguez, and my pronouns are they, them. Today, I will be teaching the concept of chusmeria as practiced by the Latina comedy duo, the Chonga Girls. Welcome to Fix Your Face and Use Your Words, Chusmeria, the Chonga Girls, and Aesthetic Conceptions of Freedom. This introduction to chusmeria and my theorization on La Mueca will span the disciplines of Caribbean studies, ethnic studies, queer studies, and performance studies. So to streamline our exploration, we will be firstly creating a community glossary for key terms just to bridge the gaps between Spanglish within this project. Secondly, we're going to dive into the theoretical frameworks provided by queer Latinx scholars Munoz and Vargas. Third, we will watch a Chonga Girls YouTube, or as they would say, YouTube video, and apply my theorization of La Mueca onto it, and in total, thereby engage with manifestations of resistance in the forms of self-fashioning, self-definition, excess, and waste. These resistances work against white middle-class subjectivities that define good citizenship to propose alternative, more pleasurable ways of being and expressing as people of color, specifically for those least privileged of people of color, working class, queer, and queered women-ex of color. So here I've defined some of the key terms. Let's start with chusmeria. So chusmeria is a Cubanismo, or Cuban saying, that describes class-stratified behaviors that are often connected to Blackness, sexual and gendered non-normativity, and non-Americanness. Chusmeria can manifest as perceived promiscuity, cheap and lowbrow fashions, and urban and non-domestic vernacular. So the important thing about chusmeria is that it goes against white middle-class bourgeois etiquette. Can anyone give me a word or two words that could describe a behavior like this? Yes, Anastasia? Ooh, you hit the nail on the head. Does anyone have any more of that? You can just speak your truth. Okay, good. Okay, so all of this is hitting it on the head. So chusma is someone who practices chusmeria, and then chonga is more of an identity-based version of chusma. So it means specifically a young working class Latina who exhibits emotional expressivity, aggression, and sexuality. The important thing about this is working class. These behaviors that are seen as not polite or not appropriate are instantly going to be connected to poverty because and inferiority within the socioeconomic hierarchy, basically. So does anyone have any examples of chongas in media? I bet Professor K does. You know who I'm talking about. Ooh. Does anyone else have any other celebrities that you think would sort of mesh into the idea of a chonga? Yes.
Well, this is not necessarily a celebrity, but I'm pretty sure. Y'all remember Bonquisha? Yes. That's what I think.
Ooh. Yes.
Amalia de la Negra.
Okay, yes. Ah, my Cuban sis. Okay, Can't write all the examples down, but we can continue. The city girls would also sort of fit into this mode of like being non-respectable, even though they're not Latina. So next is disarticulation. So disarticulation is more of a theoretical term also. It means a non-speech articulation. So an expression of meaning or emotion, but outside of language. So some examples of disarticulations would be a yell, a sob. Does anyone else have any other examples? Yes, come on.
There are those memes where it's like cries in Spanish, but it's just like the meme.
Okay, yeah, we can put cries in Spanish. Anything else?
What about like gestures, like?
That's getting to my exact point next. So I'll just put it here also, gestures. Anyone else? Yes?
Oh, we were having a discussion. Like,
Oh, yeah.
So that's why I got to
You're right. Yes, Ebony?
The meme of when you look at someone like rude, like you look at them but don't say anything. There's a look of disdain.
This is going exactly into our next question. Do you want to add, Langston?
Yeah, style, fashion.
Of course, of course. So y'all are right on the money with this. This is exactly where I'm trying to go. So other disarticulations, specifically noise-related disarticulations, happen during sex. So moans, groans, grunts. These are all things that are expressing meaning and emotion without having to say anything in verbal language. So one of the reasons why disarticulations are looked down upon is because of sort of the Descartes model of like, what you think is what you are. So if you cannot express within language, you are an animal. So disarticulations are often connected to being inferior. But here I'm trying to argue within my project that disarticulations, specifically la mueca, can be an important tool within the armory of people of color for fighting back against white supremacy and these hierarchies that place non-language articulations at the bottom as animals. So the mueca, I think Ebony was talking about the face that you make, but you don't say anything, but people see the face and they know what you're thinking. That's sort of what the mueca is. So mueca means a face or grimace. There's not an exact translation from Spanish into English, but it means the face that someone makes to show intentional emotion. That can be like disbelief, it can be disgust, it can be disdain, you know, it can be a lot of things. It could also be positive emotions, but the point of la mueca is that it centralizes the person who is doing the face. So it typically doesn't show positive emotions because it's supposed to be showing an internal emotion externally without any language. It's supposed to speak for itself. So we'll just draw a little mueca right here so you can remember what that means. Okay, so I was saying a mueca is a face that is made to openly express intentional emotion. And we're gonna talk specifically now about the poster that's right here. Also, I defined affect here. I'm not gonna define it within this PowerPoint because it's just sort of the theoretical frameworks that we're working within, but knowing that not all of us are from the same disciplines, I want to let you know that affect means the experience of feeling or emotion. So when I'm talking about white affect, that means how white people experience or show off their emotion. When I'm talking about white middle class affect, that's the etiquette that is seen as appropriate within that. So now we're gonna move into the poster. Y'all can look at your handouts. There's the slide right there if you wanna take a closer look. So the first things that are noticeable about this poster. Does anyone wanna raise their hand or yell out what you see first? Yes?
Like the positioning of the body, open legs.
Right, so sort of sexualized and also seen as rude for having her legs wide open. Catarina? Oh. Anyone else want to add? Kamaria?
The muñeca face, because she's like crying.
Mm.
I was gonna say, is she crying?
So I think that's actually just makeup. But makeup that's very exaggerated. So other things, she's presumably a Latina woman and she's depicted of being a larger size. She is eating and taking photos at the same time. She's in revealing clothes. She's in chancletas or flip-flops, which you usually don't leave the house with or that's looked down upon. Additionally, she has hoop earrings on and she has the chonga hairstyle, which is the pointed bangs. And let's read the caption. This sort of takes us right in the direction that we're going in, which is that clearly the artist is trying to magnify her excess. It's trying to magnify her exaggerations and how she is outside of a etiquette or a polite way of being. So the tagline is, ella se está echando fresco en la papaya, or she's blowing fresh air in her vagina. This is a Cuban saying also that typically is used for women who are not working, and it's basically meant to say she's wasting time. So remember this example because it's going to connect to our theoretical frameworks beautifully in a moment. Let's see. So next slide. First, before we go into the Chonga Girls YouTube video, I wanted to ask you to take a visual economy of the Chonga Girls with me. So let's look and think, how does their style and their ways of expressing go against white middle-class norms? Yes, Kayla?
The one in the red.
Oh.
Very expressive. And the face is like, I don't know what they're talking about, but I can feel the passion.
Right, flicking the nails. Anyone else, Langston?
I would say I'm not full conformity to femininity or masculinity.
Agreed, I agree. This is sort of fluid within like how she's wearing her merch, and even though there's like femme things, there's also some more masculine type or masculinized behaviors that they're performing. Yes, Anastasia?
I feel like a lot of the style is about elongating yourself and making your presence bigger, so longer nails, bigger earrings, brighter colors, hats, and bigger hair. So like I just feel like it's making you larger than yourself.
Right, so more visibility, more exaggerated with all the senses. Not just visibility, but audibility. When you play the video, we're gonna hear them loud and clear. Does anyone wanna add on? Yes, Vanessa.
You can tell that they're not like white Americans and they're not trying to be, like they're actually trying to be themselves.
Agreed. So other things that y'all didn't mention, the gestures and the body language. So, well, Kayla mentioned the gestures, but look at the body language within the, I think it's bottom leftmost corner, right, of that GIF, right? What about personal space?
They're leaning into each other.
Right, so the norms of personal space are different. There's more of like an intimidation getting up in the face of someone, but it's also not typically aggressive. It's not aggressive, it's just a way of being. Langston?
The range of motion is just generally very wide.
Right, wider range of motion, taking up more space instead of being small and submissive as like white womanhood typically asserts. Yes, Anastasia?
A little provocative, especially with how she bends over and sort of like toots her butt out.
And then additionally, we can talk about the vernacular that they're using. So this saying, it says, if you don't like it, wait, this is me. If you don't like it, go make caca somewhere else. So that bringing in of Spanglish and like affectation within, otherwise they're just speaking English, and this is a BuzzFeed video. They're speaking English and Spanglish for like a majority English speaking audience. And then also the vernacular of nails did, breaking sort of the grammar to just get the point across more. It still has meaning, it just is not following grammar that is typically white supremacist. So going off of that, we're gonna go specifically into our theory work right now. So stay with me, make confused faces, I'll pay attention, I care about muecas. So, so first I'm gonna be breaking down Jose Esteban Muñoz's Feeling Brown. So Feeling Brown discusses the emotional expressivity of Latinx ways of being to push back on the normalization of white affect and United States conceptions of what it means to act appropriately in public and in private. So rather than accept the white perception that Latina emotionality is exotic or spicy or over the top or excessive, Muñoz says, no. Latina expressivity is not excessive, whiteness is lacking. He posits that whiteness is akin to emotional impoverishment and theorizes that black and brown folks, being that we have less barriers between being that we are going to experience a lot more violences in public and in private, we have less barriers between our internal worlds and our external worlds. So we can't suppress our emotions on the same level that white people can. And because of that, we have had to develop new ways of expressing emotion as well as reacting. So white people and institutionally white supremacy facilitates emotional repression that disconnects individuals from their own bodies, so as to easily make people more machines. When you make people think less of their bodies as important and just think about production, that's like one of the central parts of dehumanization within colonialism, capitalism, and so on. So Latina affects of emotional expressivity performs feelings in a way that pushes back against white supremacy and reclaims the body as a feeling, sensing subject that will be seen and will be heard in its pains, rather than beaten down into respectable silence and hidden conditions of violence. And period. So parallel. Vargas, in Ruminations of Lo Sucio as a Latino queer analytic, reclaims the term sucio, which means dirty, nasty, filthy, and makes it a lens instead to resist capital production. So Vargas recognizes that unproductive labor of Latinas is often seen as lazy, inept, and nasty. So going back to this poster, as you can see on your handouts, the assertion that a Latina woman, and largely Black and brown women in general, cannot pass time leisurely without a negative connotation. So the notion that chilling, just passing the time, being happy by yourself, is akin to airing out your pussy, well, pardon my Spanish, is there's a violence there. There's a presumption of where your pussy should be within the workforce and also domestic and non-domestic labor. So that is a gendered and classed prejudice. Further, Vargas notes waste as temporal and waste as sensorial. All that means is wasting time and space. Wasting time and space with acts of loitering, which just means hanging out, gossiping, putting more investment in pleasure and play rather than how much should I produce by the end of the day for a white system of capitalism. So rather than producing material capital and instead producing pleasure and like emotional, sensorial capital for the self and for communities, this is a way of reordering capitalism's hierarchy in a way that typically prioritizes like production over the backs and bodies of Black women and brown women. So how I connect La Mueca to this. Yeah, a lot of muecas, a lot of gifts. So moving forward, I place La Mueca against white supremacy as a display of emotion that transcends language and centralizes the individual, making La Mueca. Colonialism, capitalism, and other assimilatory practices have stripped many people of color away from our indigenous tongues and left us with a colonizer language that is unequipped to fully express the range of feelings, both good and bad, that we experience. Moreover, the neoliberal strategy of conflict resolution, use your words, use your words. What if the language is not yours in the first place? So that assertion of using your words to fight back, when fighting back oppressions, is inadequate for the racialized others who this language wasn't made for in the first place. Making faces and, done?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, finish out your thought.
Oh, I'll finish that thought. So making faces and gestures then and not fixing our faces is an act of decoloniality that transcends language and transgresses white feeling. Thank you.
All right, greetings everyone. My name is Dr. Artemis Cunningham. I am a guest lecturer here today from Stanford University. And so the title of today's lecture is Paradise Lost, the Price of Sex, Race, Disabled Bodies and Souls. Okay, first the objectives. So first I will explain what the religious model of disability is, since this is a disabilities theory-heavy work that I'm going to perform. Next, I will define what it means to be disabled during this time period. This time period is the English Renaissance, spanning roughly from the 1500s to the 1800s. Next, what does this definition imply? In other words, how does it kind of interact with the society? And how does this definition relate to other critical discourses? Lastly, I will utilize the text Paradise Lost as a literary way of othering from the perspective of John Milton, who is the author. Okay, so the term religious model of disability was first coined by Edward Wheatley. And if someone would please look at the handout and actually read the comprehensive definition for me. Anyone? Asia?
Some people, if not many, believe that some disabilities are a result of lack of adherence to social morality and religious proclamations that warn against engaging in certain behaviors. To further explain this model, some beliefs are based upon the assumption that some disabilities are a result of punishment from an all-powerful entity. Furthermore, the belief that the punishment is for an act or acts of transgression against prevailing moral and or religious ethics.
Thank you, Asia. Okay, so to kind of just highlight some of the main points there, you can even refer to the part where I go into the blessings, curses, and tests of faith. Essentially, this model of disability is tying or creating an understanding of how religion affects and shapes the representation of disabilities, what it constitutes, or how you would define disability. That's kind of the crux of this model, right? And then next, what does it do? So this provides a method for understanding how disabilities were perceived during the medieval times and the English Renaissance. And this is important because unlike the other models of disability that will not be discussed in this PowerPoint, but that do exist in modern disability theory, this model is the best for kind of surveying this time period. And then lastly, why is this important? This model is important because it still is prominent in many societies today, as well as our own. And it also provides context for the many tropes. We may not realize how many of these tropes still exist, but do we have any Game of Thrones fans in here? Okay, a few of you. So Bran Snow, I don't want to ruin anything, but he had an accident where he was no longer able to walk after falling. And so this trope becomes when you become disabled, or if you're born with a disability, then your other senses become heightened and essentially compensate for it. So for those who don't know, Bran essentially has like sight beyond sight, essentially. And so that would be a part of the trope of compensation for a disability. And next, how to view disabilities during the Renaissance. So according to John Milton, you could essentially categorize disability by about 4 to 5 sections. You have sex, race, the body, which would be the physical, the mind, and the soul. So according to Milton, if you are a woman and really anything other than a male, you would be considered disabled due to your inherent inferiority. In terms of race, you would have, as long as you are a non-white European, according to Milton, you would be considered disabled because he would consider you to be not as intelligent or not as pure. Next, you have the body, which encompasses any sort of physical impairments or deformities. And this is important because Milton himself was blind, actually. Yet he still believed disabilities of the physical nature to have a tie to the soul and essentially be a reflection, which goes into the next part, a reflection of who one is, right? So then we go to the mind and the soul. The idea of madness was very prominent during this time period. The idea that you could be labeled mad if you went against the societal norm, hierarchies. Essentially, as long as you were an other, you would be considered mad. And back to the whole sin aspect of this, which ties closely to the religion and the soul. The idea that your disability is a result of your actions. And all of these themes Milton implements in his work, Paradise Lost. Next, its connection to other critical discourses. Will someone please read the first bullet point for me?
Feminism, the theory of the political, economic, and social equality of the sexes.
Thank you. Second.
An approach to literary and cultural study that rejects traditional categories of gender and sexuality.
Ebony.
Critical race theory, critical analysis of race and racism from a legal point of view.
Thank you, everyone. So I highlighted these 3, but there are other critical discourses that can be applied to Milton's work. But I chose feminism first because of how he portrays women in the work Paradise Lost. It is a little political and it is very derogatory. And it definitely goes against the social equality of the sexes. Next, I chose queer theory. And this is actually not my PowerPoint, but if you look at your handout, you will see my explanation of this. I use queer theory because there is a section where Milton discusses the angels and their sexuality. The angels actually don't have a specific sex. They are sex fluid. They can actually move between both. And so I thought that this was very interesting in how he kind of ties this idea of sex not necessarily being structured, yet he still has a lot of biases against it. And lastly, critical race theory ties to his idea of this place called the realm of vanity, also known as the limbo of fools, paradise of fools, however you wish to call it. It's essentially this area where Milton actually states that if you were Dominican, if you were Chinese, he mentioned actually a couple of other races, but essentially if you were not a white European, you would not be allowed into heaven, not due to your works, but due to your birth. Next, I have a brief overview of kind of the key terms in Paradise Lost. According to Milton, this is how Milton kind of portrays some of the biblical events in his work Paradise Lost. So we have prelapsarian, which is a term to describe all events that took place before the fall of man. You have Satan's fall from grace, which is, according to Milton, where Satan revolted against his father God, and the aftermath of that would be that he was literally plunged headfirst from heaven into hell. And then lastly, there is the eating of the fruit. In Paradise Lost, Eve was convinced by Satan to eat an apple from the tree of forbidden knowledge. Adam, upon seeing what Eve hath done, he ate fruit from the tree as well, and essentially damned humanity and led to the fall. Also, there is one piece that I did not include here, but I think will actually be important later on, is to know the connotation of the symbol of the snake in Paradise Lost. The image of the snake is oftentimes in Paradise Lost tied to Satan. He actually turned himself into a snake, and there is a punishment later on where he is forcibly turned into a snake. And essentially the idea of the snake relates to deceit, corruption, and purity. Now, this is going to be a very quick character analysis. I actually include a slightly more in-depth character analysis on your handout, but to just quickly go through 4 characters. First, we have Adam. Adam would be the ideal human being according to John Milton, where he was essentially, he did not possess a disability. He was not oppressed by anyone. He was physically able to do all of the tasks assigned to him by God. He was mentally strong and spiritually superior. Thank you. Next, we have Satan. Satan would be considered a disabled character, not due to the fact that he believed himself to be oppressed by God, but more tied to the physical and the spiritual. When Satan revolted against God, he fell from grace, literally. So as he physically fell further away from God in Paradise Lost, his body began to change. So as he was spiritually away from God, his body became contorted. He became more of the devil that we will probably view today, a being with horns, leathery skin. And so essentially his outward appearance reflected the corruptness of his soul, right? Next we have Eve, who, according to Milton, was inferior to Adam due to her being a woman. And so due to this believed inferiority, Eve was actually the target of Satan because Satan believed that she would be the easiest to corrupt. And also, back to Milton's point on the spiritual aspect of this, Eve was actually also targeted by Satan due to the fact that she was perceived to be further away from God due to the fact that while Adam was created by God, Eve was created from Adam, placing her further away from the Father. And lastly, we have sin and error, where sin is actually the embodiment of sin, and error is another character from Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen, which actually influenced heavy Paradise Lost. They were both described as women who were half serpent, and they embody wrongness, essentially. The whole idea that sin would be the wrongness of the spirit and error would be the wrongness of judgment. And so what is the price of this? It's harmful to women. This is a very misogynistic piece, as I'm sure you guys can tell. It is an obstacle to a socially progressive society. It perpetuates inhumane views towards people who are considered the other, which goes back to the whole idea of madness. And it ostracizes people for their individuality. And I'd actually like to open this up to the audience about other problematic, and when I say problematic, I'm thinking more in the context of how does this piece, or at least what you've heard about it so far or read in your handout, how does it affect society today? Do you see any kind of themes that still perpetuate? Yeah.
This is kind of the actual backup in the catechism for like the reason that women can't be priests in the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
Because they have that, they believe there's a spiritual barrier between them and God.
Exactly.
To me, like, and this is just a thought that I had while you were presenting, it seemed like this is almost like the starting point for the evolution of the double standard, because like Eve did not eat the apple, but Adam did the same thing, but she's considered to be the one that damaged humanity, but you're saying in this book it was actually Adam eating the apple too? Well, at least that's how I interpret the slide, that actually damaged humanity, but we still penalize Eve in social justice.
You're absolutely right. Did I see another hand up there?
Also, just for like societies that are more inclusive of disabled bodies and disabled people, like the trope of like seeing disabled people as either magical, like you were talking about the trope within Game of Thrones, or seeing them as like inherently wrong, stops people from actually inputting like policies and like structural changes in society that would actually just help everyone live the way that they are. So there's still an onus on like you need to change your body, I guess is what I'm saying. Yeah. Period.
Absolutely. Omar?
So this really makes me, think back, especially even before Christianity, with the Roman times where most people were within, the Roman faith, and how like it was considered at the time. I know specifically for it to be like you were considered like insane for loving your wife. You weren't like. Because she was such an inferior being, marriage was just like a political thing that you did, and she was just an object that you attained to say, hey, I'm allied with this man. So it's just very interesting to see how, while it is very embodied within this specific sect of the Christian faith, it's something that's sort of been ingrained in our society even before that came along.
Absolutely right. That actually leads into my final main point. The idea that this model, while it is focused on the medieval times and the Renaissance, actually perpetuates throughout history, both past, present, and unfortunately, perhaps the future, if we're not very careful. And that is it.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to invite you all right now just to take a deep breath. Exhale. We're going to have a great experience. It's going to be an awesome journey that we're about to go on for the next 15 minutes. My name is Dr. Excell. My presentation is entitled Crowning Justice, Decolonizing Our Bodies and Resisting Censorship. So, right now, I would like you to imagine. You can close your eyes, you can keep them open, it's up to you. You are watching your favorite television show. When a commercial comes on, the camera shot begins and it's zoomed in on the legs and the hips of an overly oiled woman. As the camera proceeds, it shows the breasts, which are not only perfectly perky, but also spilling over just to cover the nipple. Then we finally see her face, and of course, we are not surprised that she is a blonde-haired, blue-eyed woman. And then we begin to see her hair cascade in the wind, and we get the experience of just being free. But there's a lot of body shots. We're seeing a lot of her body. And then the commercial ends, and we realize that was a commercial for bobby pins. That, my friends, is looking through the male gaze. You might be saying, what is the male gaze?
The male gaze is a theoretical framework that was coined by Laura Mulvey in 1975, and originally it was used to apply the way in which women were viewed in film theory. However, because of the fact that women are objectified in nearly every arena of American life, we can kind of finesse it and spread it to other areas. So the male gaze occurs when the audience is put into the perspective of a heterosexual male. A scene may focus on the curves of a woman's body, putting the viewer in the eye of the male, kind of like our bobby pin commercial, right? We didn't even see the bobby pin. Curves are highlighted with specific conventions such as slow motion, deliberate camera movements, and cutaways. So essentially, once again, objectifying the female form. So we are going to get a little bit into the male gaze as it relates to our social media world that we live in. So I want to issue a trigger warning. The following contains a series of what some would deem sexually provocative. I'm all about self-care and self-work. If you need to step outside, take a drink of water, take a little lap around the building, you do you. No harm done. Okay. This is for Cologne. Chris Brown's new single, Wobble Up. Chanel, but also like a lot of other stuff, but Chanel. Sorry, that was supposed to be another image of a woman in a pink. You know how they do Victoria's Secret is pink, so it was her butt, but I don't know why this is doing a little bit of a glitch. But essentially, you get the point of where we're going with this male gaze. We see it in our visual culture all the time. So I want you to reflect in the groups around you. How often do you see these images on your social media feed, and how are they presented? And then second, how did seeing these images make you feel? So discuss in your groups just a little bit. Alrighty, I know it's a little short discussion, but we do have to get to back to the larger presentation. So can I get a couple share out? How did those images make you feel? What were your first reactions? Have you seen these images before? Are they on your feed? What's up?
So something we discussed is usually we, like me and Cassandra don't really see it just because like that's how we have curated our social media feeds and all that. But also the male gaze isn't always this hypersexual image. We're talking about specifically like tampon and pad commercials. They're not necessarily something that like they're not necessarily something that like women would want to see, but they're comfortable for men. You know, they don't really talk about the pad. They pour a blue liquid on it. Like, it's not anything that is uncomfortable to talk about. And it's usually some woman like, I play tennis, I do ballet, like that kind of thing. I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about how much blood it soaks up.
Exactly. So I love that. You already into the lesson. I love it. Keep it up, y'all.
How some of these images make me feel when I see them on TV is that I'm not buying this product. So like I saw a commercial for some bras and it was like the guy was like hyping up the girl, like really hyping her up, and I'm like, who's the product? Who are you promoting it to? Because I feel like I'm gonna buy this product for my boyfriend's pleasure, not my own.
Ooh, y'all been reading. Go ahead.
So I brought up how like on social media now there's been a bunch of like new policies put in place to basically not let sex workers like promote themselves. So if like Kim Kardashian posts like half nude, like her shit, because she has money and because she has like social status within like social media, like her shit won't be flagged or put like a content warning on. But like sex workers, like they'll either have their like posts deleted or like the algorithm will change it so that people can't see their stuff just if they're open about being sex workers.
Yes, I love that. We're getting into racial underlinings, women, gender. I love it. So y'all are on track. Go ahead.
This picture in particular is just so interesting to me because I didn't realize that it was a men's cologne, but
You're okay.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. I'm closing.
Sorry. But this fragrance, the way that it's literally like, here, you like this, right? Yeah, I bet you like this too. Like it's almost like they're treating the male gaze as like you would treat a dog, but you want to go in the cage.
Yeah.
Like I feel like this is like
great analogy.
Just very like I don't know what word I'm looking for.
Pervasive in your face, kind of like blam. Here it is.
Yeah.
Definitely. So I want you not to throw all these conversations we just had away, but put them on the back burner a little bit because we're going to get a little deeper into this. So I would like to issue a second trigger warning. The following images are ones related to birth and the body. Once again, if you feel uncomfortable, take a step out, no problem. Y'all, my videos are not trying to play today, but it's okay. So this image is one of a water birth, and so what you would have saw was a baby being delivered into the world, and the mother carrying and coddling her baby fresh out the womb. So I can definitely give you the links for all of those videos, but you kind of get what I'm showing you in this one. So what I want you to reflect on now, back to your same groups, or you can switch it up a little bit, is prior to today, have you ever seen a live birth? How did seeing these images make you feel? Why? And then how often do you see these particular images on social media, and how are they presented? So return back to your groups, and we're going to talk a little bit, and then come back to the larger group. To go back? Okay. What happened? I don't know how to. It's fine. It's okay. We're not even going to study it. All right. Let's get back to the large group. What did you talk about? Have you seen these images on social media? How did they make you feel? Were you a little squirmish? Let's talk about it. Hopefully some different hands, but.
We discussed it a little bit. I have seen live birth, and I just really don't want to have kids like that. It was like
Okay.
Yeah,
So a little too much. A little too much. Okay.
I've seen a live birth before, specifically in class and like child development or
Nice.
but it's like rare when I see it on my like timeline.
Okay, rare.
My mom is a labor and delivery nurse, and my aunt is a midwife, so I've seen a lot.
Okay.
Growing up, I was kind of like, it kind of put me off because I think we're taught that, like, there's supposed to be a lot of shame around the female body. But as I've grown up, I think I appreciate it a lot more for what it is.
That's awesome. Okay, last one, great.
So I've never seen any live birth videos on social media except when I go on proposal on YouTube to go look at them. And then to add to that, it's a thing that I'm like, what I see is that most of the times in terms of like giving birth and stuff, these initial things are seen as disgusted. And they're like, we don't want that. They only appreciate like fan bodies when they're objectified.
Took the words right out of my mouth, and that's amazing. Okay, so we are getting right into what you just said, censoring women's bodies. So when you're on social media and you go to click on a live birth video, you will see this interesting notification. It says this video contains sensitive content, which some people might find offensive or disturbing, right? But as my colleague Rhea just said, it's birth. It's the most natural thing. But when it comes to women who are maybe like in an ad or twerking or something of that nature, where it's convenient for men to objectify, it's seen as something that's okay. So the condemning of breastfeeding and other depictions of birth as inappropriate for social media perpetuates the idea that only certain women's bodies performing certain activities, such as being sexually subservient to men, are acceptable. Thus, we can kind of see how social media and our visual culture act as kind of like a microcosm for the ways in which we treat women in a larger society. Now, what I don't want you all to think is the fact that during this presentation we're pitting two issues against each other, because we're not. I believe that women can be sexually agentic in their own right and reclaiming their sexuality, but we're specifically talking about in terms of the male gaze, which seeks to make birth pornographic and objectify women through social media visual culture such as ads. So what are people doing about this? we are going to employ Audre Lorde's uses of the erotic. The erotic has often been misnamed by men and used against women. It has been made into the confused, the trivial, the psychotic, the plasticized sensation. Kind of sounds like our commercials, right? For this reason, we have often turned away from the exploration and consideration of the erotic as a source of power, of information, confusing it with its opposite, the pornographic. But pornography is a direct denial of the power of the erotic. So for your homework this week, you can conveniently go back to this lovely chart I made, the pornographic versus the erotic, kind of see the differences because like we talked about, pornography emphasizes sensation without feeling, but the erotic is that internal, yes, this feels good to me, this is amazing. The pornographic keeps women docile while using the erotic allows women to be agentic, and the underlining of that is fearlessness and overall joy. So what does this have to do with birth? Oh my gosh, this picture is duplicated everywhere. So sorry, y'all. What does this have to do? This is actually supposed to be a photo of some midwives in the South, but the world's oldest profession is midwifery. Now you're saying, what does this have to do with midwifery? Well, in the current Black birth worker movement, midwives are reclaiming their time, reclaiming the bodies of women by saying, hey, you need to see birth. Look at what we're doing. These are amazing things. This is a natural process. Everyone should lay witness to this erotic power. So, going off of the erotic power as well as bell hooks' oppositional gaze. Now, during enslavement, how bell hooks kind of has coined this term is the fact that during enslavement, Black Americans weren't allowed to look at the punishment, weren't allowed to look at oppression in their face. But through utilizing the oppositional gaze, we are becoming resistant. We're saying we can see what you're doing to us. By midwives posting on social media, posting birth, you can see, hey, this is natural. This is something a way I can reclaim my body and reclaim my time, essentially. So once again, this is just the comparison and the combination of the erotic and the oppositional gaze that Black birth workers are using. Once again, you can check in your Canvas and you can have all this PowerPoint and see everything together. So overall, midwives inspire Black women by showcasing natural birth and helping to validate and reaffirm the importance, necessity, and beauty of Black life and Black birth. How this fits over... Y'all, this PowerPoint is all screwed up, but it's okay because y'all got it on Canvas. How this fits into my larger work is that I want to show how Black midwives are consistently resisting not only the medical industrial complex, but a social media empire that says only certain women's bodies are beautiful. So we can objectify you, but don't give birth because it's crazy. Like, to have sex, you have to have your baby, right? That's how we all got here, through a supernatural process, but it's only convenient when men are allowed to objectify women. So I will get this PowerPoint to y'all so y'all can peruse it with all the lovely photos that I spent time on. However, does anybody have any questions right now? Thank you. Y'all, my PowerPoint was cute, y'all, but it's okay. It's okay. We're going to go with it.
Thanks, so good afternoon, y'all. I'm Naive Gaytan, and I'd like to welcome y'all to Latin American Revolutionary Movements, a class that's cross-listed under History and Latin American and Caribbean Studies. Today's class is on Tierra y Libertad, which translates to Land and Liberty in Mexico. So my objectives for today's class include to introduce y'all to the Zapatistas, also known as their acronym EZLN, and their movement in southern Mexico, discuss the implications of economic policies in Mexico and their implications on indigenous land rights, and finally touch on the dynamics of racial and ethnic identity and oppression in a Mexican context. So to begin to situate ourselves and our case study of the Zapatistas, here's a map of Mexico. The Zapatistas have a significant presence in southern Mexico, specifically in the state of Chiapas, right here, which shares a border with Guatemala, shaded in green. And as an introduction to the Zapatista Army, or by their full name, the Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional, which translates to Zapatista Army of National Liberation. Their flag is pictured right there on your right. So essentially, the Zapatistas, their ideological figurehead was Emiliano Zapata, who was a revolutionary of the 1910 Mexican Revolution. He led a peasant revolutionary army. He was from southern Mexico, which also shares a parallel with the Zapatista movement that I will be discussing later today. So as a leader of the peasant revolutionary army, his main concept was Tierra y Libertad, which I referenced in the title, in the sense that he wanted the land to be free for the people in the hands of those who worked it, instead of those of the rich ruling class, and then liberty in general, to be free from the oppression brought on by oligarchs and dictators in the country, which was the reason the revolution was happening in the first place. And then, borrowing from his ideology, the Zapatistas, or EZLN, was founded in 1983, and they were more clandestine in the sense that they were very careful about their organizing. They started off on a very small scale, and then they became public. Their movement was on January 1st, 1994, which was the day that legislation, specifically the North American Free Trade Agreement, also known as NAFTA, was signed into law. So in reaction to this, with the Zapatistas, they decided to push forth the first declaration and revolutionary laws from the Lacandon jungle, which was essentially a declaration of war against the Mexican government, because the government, they felt that they weren't being listened to through their peaceful protests, which included methods such as sit-ins and protests. And through their collective organization as an army of liberation, they were willing to use violence to convince the government to adhere to its promise, as mentioned in the Constitution, to grant them goals of autonomy of lands, access to the resources that are housed in the lands, and their use, of course, in addition to advocating for the protection and inclusion of indigenous peoples in Mexico, because historically indigenous peoples have been marginalized by the Mexican government since it was established as a nation state in, I don't remember what year, but in the late 1900s. So, I'm a history major, y'all. I'm bad at dates. But to touch again on NAFTA and its implications, so the North American Free Trade Agreement was an agreement between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, which set out to lower or eliminate tariffs on certain trade items. And one of the implications in this context regarding land rights was the situation with farming. So indigenous communities in Mexico, they have this system of collective landholding, and they would all work their lands. But you see, if a community is very small and centralized, does not have the same resources as a larger corporation that can work and pay farmers perhaps like less, but then also produce on a larger scale. So this directly jeopardized the well-being of indigenous communities who largely depended on agriculture to make their living and survive in such an oppressive society, where like the government refuses to donate more to their communities to meet their needs, and they have to fend for themselves for a larger part. And one of the most pressing direct implications of NAFTA was the removal of Article 27, Section 7 of the Mexican Constitution, because when the revolution happened, one of the main points was redistribution of lands. And with NAFTA, they decided to take away this part that promised land repatriation to indigenous groups in favor to prioritize the ability of making more money for the Mexican country as a whole and for the greater good, as it always goes. But it's not good for a lot of people at the end of the day. So in order to one of my main research interests is understanding why basically these decisions are made and who makes them. So questioning these dynamics of power. So to better understand this, we can turn to this reading from last night. It's an excerpt from French and Manzanares, page 39. Can I have a volunteer read this, please? Ooh, oh, there's so many of y'all. Okay, Langston, please.
So Mexico's independence from Spain in 1821 displaced the peninsulares from the highest positions of power and status in the former colony. In great part, criollos and mestizos reaped the benefits of this change. The dominance of criollos and mestizos in the life of Mexico have undeniably been kept since then. At the bottom of society are the Indians.
Thank you so much for that, Langston. Okay, y'all, so I have highlighted and bolded these terms. Well, I forgot to bold one of them, but that's okay. So essentially, I decided to highlight these because they help explain and are critical to understanding the hierarchy of race and ethnicity in Mexico and mostly Latin America in general. So specifically, peninsulares refers to individuals that have Spanish ancestry from Spain, straight from Spain, that had like so much power in the colonial era, but since they were cast out, later criollos. So criollos are people with Spanish ancestry that were born in Latin America. So now they have some sort of claim to Latinidad or like Mexicanness, even though they're still like extremely white and still have that genealogy of power that they've inherited. Mestizos is a term that refers to individuals with a mix of indigenous and European ancestry. Also, to expand on this point, So there was a Mexican philosopher, Jose Vasconcelos. He published a piece called La Raza Cósmica, or the Cosmic Race, which essentially he pitched the idea of a new mestizo, which was composed of the best of all the races, which is inherently anti-black, anti-indigenous in itself. But then like this ideology was very highly supported by the Mexican government, and in popular media, like themes like this were pushed to create a sense of national identity because like the nation was so divided in terms of like race and like identity, like as it was stratified, as was by design by the Spaniards. So this mestizex identity was supposed to help create a sense of collectivity. And then also, I just said mestizex. Just to explain that, I use the term mestizex because it's not gendered, because the Spanish language is inherently gendered, and this is one way to make this identity less marginalizing, if that makes sense. And then also one of the last terms listed right here, actually the last term, is Indians, and like that's not the best term, but in this text it's used to refer to indigenous peoples of Mexico. And also one more thing I'd like to add to this is that this piece does not touch at all on the presence of Black Mexicans, which is historically like written out even though that these communities still exist and are not recognized largely because of anti-Blackness that's embedded in the Mexican community, a relic of that anti-Blackness and colonialism. But before I switch to that, let's see. Okay, let's see. So again, like since like Langston read that this power and status has like been carried on and has so much influence, so now that criollos and mestizos are able to occupy these upper echelons of society, they have these decision-making powers. Their proximity to whiteness is definitely very beneficial. Additionally, even if like Latin American identities such as Mexicans and other nationalities are marginalized in other contexts, for instance in the United States, that does not mean that people of Latin American descent of like any race or ethnicity cannot oppress individuals in their own countries who occupy less higher social statuses. So in this sense, indigenous and Black communities are consistently oppressed by like the whiter or like the closer to whiteness of the criollos and mestizos. And also another side note, criollo is not really used as much anymore. Like it's just like, oh, well, we're all Mexican. But that in itself erases so much of the nuance that occupies this identity because there is still colorism, racism. There's still like very disparaging terms used against indigenous peoples and Black peoples in the country and even within communities here in the United States. Let's see, I touched on the post-racial identity. Okay, so now that we're on the terms of post-racial identity, what does that look like? So here you have images of 15 public figures. Their occupations include athletes, activists, and performers, and they're all Mexican. So I'd like to hear some general comments or questions, observations, your thoughts on the composition of these images. Yes, Anastasia.
They're mostly all light skin.
Let's see, correct. I wanted to touch on that. What else? Yes, Sienna?
The guy on the bottom row with the red hair, he's
Yes.
like redheaded, and that's not what I usually think of when I see like, when I think of like a Mexican person or a person
Definitely.
that is of Mexican descent.
Bear?
The guy on the bottom hand or to the right, he looks like Native American.
No, yeah, definitely. He is Mexican, and then he also, on his father's side, he's Cherokee, so it's like double indigeneity, if that makes sense. Asia?
The guitar, like the guy with the guitar.
Yes.
He looked like me.
Yeah. So that's Abraham Laboriel Sr. He was born in Mexico City, lived there until his early 20s, came to the US. I think he studied at Berklee College of Music. He's like one of the most renowned bassists. Yeah. Yes, please.
There's not a lot of older ladies. I see the one.
Dolores Huerta, leader of the Farm Workers Union movement here in California.
And the older, I mean, there's like 3 older guys or 4 older guys, I guess.
Langston?
Yeah, we've got quite a bit of white passing.
Yes.
People, which is not a part of, I think, the common narrative of just Mexican heritage in America.
So just to add to that, like in Mexico, like a lot, like for example, she was the first lady of the last president. She's a famous actress. She's also another famous actress. Like if you watch novelas, y'all might know like all the leading ladies are extremely white. Like any indigenous characters, if they're included, they're either the help or things like that, or occupying some lower structure, like just like a plot device. But the leading ladies, the ones that need to be saved, are always the white ones. Always like oversaturated media in media, even if they are not necessarily the norm, if that makes sense, like the majority of society, but they still hold that kind of power and like visibility. Anastasia.
Just also the two people on the bottom row with the black hair, the man and the woman, they just look like they have almost an Asian descent to them, and like I know they're called like chinos there, right?
You are correct. Actually, the man on, let me scroll down. That is Miguel Angel Osorio Chang. He is Chinese on his mother's side. He's a politician. And Ana Gabriel, she is also a singer. She also has ancestry on her mother's side. But the term Chino, like in lots of Latin American countries, like it's used to refer, like literally means Chinese, but it's kind of like hegemonic in the sense that like, oh, anybody who looks Asian is Chino, and that's kind of messy. But yeah, like. Raquel.
Okay, so the diversity of hair, I noticed that the third person on the top row is the only person with rizos, with curls.
Mhm.
So I wanted to know why you decided to include that picture. What was the importance of highlighting that?
She's Ariana Brown. She's an amazing poet based in San Antonio. So she is very proud. Like that's like a driving force of her work to bring visibility to Afro-Mexicanas like herself, because like in media, like it's not recognized at all. Like in some places in Mexico, if you go and you ask, oh, are there black people here? Oh no, there's no black people in Mexico. What do you mean? And like that like construction of identity inherently like erases entire communities that exist, and it's pretty messed up. And it's like a relic of like this favoring of whiteness, a desire to pretend that your identity is just like, oh, we're just a beautiful mix. We're not just one thing. Don't try and divide us. And that's, yikes. Definitely a lot to be work to be done on that front. Okay. Anybody else? Okay. So that's all I have for y'all today. Thank you so much for participating and being so involved. Do you have any questions for me? Like about anything in this presentation? Okay, yes, Kamaria.
I just thought it was interesting that I forgot the musician's name, but he's like the only darker skin tone person on there. And it kind of just goes to what you were saying about how that demographic is being like erased or is erased historically. So I like that you like still include it.
Asia.
So, and please tell me if this is not necessarily within the scope of your project, but I still think it might apply. Do you think that, like how you said, if I were to go to Mexico, like, oh, where the black people live, but I don't know, it's none of y'all.
Yeah.
Do you think like that's almost a tool that the government uses to like, I guess, make black and brown issues seem kind of like it's exclusive to one another and not like, you know, like this black people Mexico, like this Latin American folk in black, like in black communities. So I mean, I hope that makes sense.
No, definitely, I hear you. Like Jose Vasconcelos' whole ideology, like, oh, it's like we're just the perfect mixed race. That's what will make Mexico get ahead. And that was just like a construction, and people kept continuing to enforce this and reinforce this image of this oversaturating the media with one image of what should be Mexican. And that is very intentional, and like buying into this colonial anti-blackness that is built on pretending that, oh no, like we're like the closer we are to whiteness, the more advanced we are, and y'all just don't belong. And that's very intentional. Yes.
I had just a thought with this mix. You said it was like politicians, athletes, musicians, and I wonder if, because you mentioned the telenovelas where like the women are white and those lead actresses, and I wonder if like in other sectors, like depending on what they look like, their phenotype, if they're like if the politicians look a particular way, you know, or there's a certain type of person who can be a politician, or the athletes look a particular way, or the type of music that you play, you know, I don't know, just that I'm curious because of these people you have included, and if that's something that you thought about or considered or noticed.
Okay, so definitely like their presence in like this media depends a lot on your accessibility to wealth. Like many of the people in these images are from wealthy backgrounds, and they did have the privilege to access these connections and networks and build their way up. But let's see. Oh, I'm sorry. Yikes. Okay. So I think time is essentially up. But again, thank y'all so much, and I hope to teach y'all more in the future.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Jacob Gresham, visiting you from Oakwood University. And today, I just want to talk to you guys on the topic of arguably two of the most important and probably ancient archetypes in literature, heroes and villains. And just starting off, I just want to say it's an honor to be here and to be able to share this information with you guys, and I hope you all get something meaningful out of this. So let's just get right to it. Now, on the board and on the screen, you see two terms, hero, villain. What characteristics come to mind when you see these two words? Yes.
When I hear hero, I hear like someone who's able to save the day.
Okay. Give me another one. Asia.
I think the heroes, they're typically attractive and villains aren't.
All right. Anaya.
I think villains are oftentimes misunderstood and underdeveloped.
All right, let's see if I can get one more. John.
Villain uses power for the individual, for themselves, and the hero uses power for their community.
Huh. I like these definitions, I do. All very good. I think they all apply really well. I think they really apply to very modern notions we have of what constitutes a hero or a villain. But I think in looking at the two terms, we have to take into account exactly where the terms originated, what they originally meant. And I think the best way to do that would be to look at epic literature. Works of Homer, Virgil, these authors from long, long ago who kind of started the whole tradition of heroes and villains in literature. And to start off, let's just look at some traditional characteristics of a hero. And can I get a volunteer to read? Yes.
You want me to read all of it?
Yes, please.
Okay, so traditional heroes are of a noble / above average position in society. They possess superhuman levels of intelligence, strength, etc. They are capable of achieving what a normal person cannot. They are great warriors who are usually already well known for deeds in war. They are well renowned as heroes at home. They act with humility and out of a sense of duty, selflessly perform good deeds, are well traveled and celebrated for deeds performed outside of their own land. They complete otherworldly tasks, battle supernaturally evil foes, will often complete their tasks with supernatural aid, and may embody many well-established values from their respective cultures.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and I think all of these characteristics apply really well to most heroes as we know them, but particularly to epic heroes. Heroes like Odysseus, Rama from the Indian epic, the Ramayana, Sundiata from an old African epic, and also to Beowulf. Aside from their culture-specific characteristics, you could pretty much swap any of these guys out for the other one in their respective stories. They all, in some form or another, pretty much meet the criteria laid out on the previous slide that you just saw. And these were who we called heroes for years and years, centuries, millennia. But then we cut to today, and these are what we call heroes. You have Luke Skywalker from Star Wars, a frequently doubtful young boy who has to develop his powers over many years. And when we first meet him, he's never left his home. He's never been in war a day in his life. Then you have Batman. Everyone loves Batman. The obsessive loner who has no supernatural abilities of any kind. Then you have Katniss Everdeen from the Hunger Games. Katniss is stubborn, closes herself off from a lot of people, becomes increasingly cold-blooded over the course of her story, and in many ways presents herself as not the most likable character. In fact, definitely not what you might call a hero. And then, of course, you have the Punisher. The Punisher, a vigilante who operates outside the law, murders with no remorse, and is not even well loved by his own country. He's feared as a criminal, this vicious being. When you look at characters like these and you think about what a traditional hero was, you have to ask yourself, how did we get to accept characters like these as our heroes today? So now I want to ask you guys, how do you feel about this? What are your thoughts? Yes.
Okay, so as a Marvel Comics lover, and to my homegirl Nia's point, I think half the reason why it's more like this now is because traditionally, like heroes like Superman, like they were so squeaky clean to the point where you couldn't even relate to them. And so versus like, at least for me, certain aspects of villains were always more relatable, especially once you got to the fact that like the stories were more complicated versus them just being an evil being. So I think like people wanted superheroes to be more accessible. So that's when you started getting like the underdog kind of superhero, like Luke Skywalker, or the cynic, like Katniss Everdeen, because like I felt that the world was pretty. Yeah.
That's an interesting perspective. Thank you. Langston.
Heroes, I think, maybe over time have become more about reasons than about deeds. So I feel like Katniss Everdeen, maybe just to focus on her, we don't necessarily see her deeds as killing people as an objective act outside the matrix of the reasons why she does it. So yeah, I think that being a hero and heroism has become about who the story follows and like why they do things they do.
Okay, thank you. Katrina.
I think it's interesting to think about like character development and how maybe today's heroes have like step away from the one-dimensionality that a character may have as a hero, or that like that image presents itself as like the good versus like now I think heroes are more like distancing themselves from the binary of good and evil, which I think is interesting. Like thinking about that in a philosophical way.
All right,
Yeah.
I like it. I see the other hands, but I'm gonna move on for the sake of time. I really liked all your answers, especially yours, Asia. You talked about relatability, sometimes even to the villains, which I think is an interesting perspective. But did you ever think that maybe the reason we call these characters heroes is actually because we don't relate to villains, but maybe we're afraid of them? If you look at the traditional villain, like Odyssey, Sundiata villains, they're not extremely complex characters. For the most part, they're monsters, these fiends, these things that kind of maybe embody our internal fears of evil or darkness, but not necessarily things we immediately recognize as a threat in our world. The best way you could describe them, honestly, would just be to look at a definition in Merriam-Webster. A character in a story or play who opposes the hero. Not a very complex definition, not a whole list of requirements they had to meet. They could be anything like this. A Cyclops, Grendel, this monster from a swamp, or Ravana, an evil spirit. Pretty fiendish looking characters, you have to admit, but we don't see things like this in our world, do we? No. But now let's look at villains today. You've got Darth Vader and the Empire from Star Wars, a fascist government with a super weapon that can obliterate entire civilizations. You've got President Snow from the Hunger Games, a dictatorial president of a corrupt United States. You have the Joker, complete anarchy incarnate, can't be controlled by the law, enjoys others' pain, complete sadism. And you have the Kingpin, common enemy for the Punisher, a criminal with his hands in the pockets of policemen, lawyers, judges, very powerful, influential people in society. Suddenly, the characters we considered villains aren't just monsters, they're not just fiends, they're things we actually fear in our world. Corrupt governments, criminals whose reach knows no bounds, and militaries with nuclear superpowers. So now we have to ask ourselves, do we let the villains shape who we accept as a hero? What do you, any thoughts on that? Thanks.
I guess like it's like that. What you just said makes me think like I'm gonna try to make this count in a way that makes sense. Like the center isn't the hero being good. The center is the evil being evil, and we'll really follow anyone who fights that, no matter what they do, no matter what their morals are, no matter who they're willing to kill. The fact of the matter is these things frame what we fear, and we really will follow any narrative that goes against that, even if we don't agree with what they do.
Thank you. Caleb.
Like you said, a lot of people love Batman. Batman be like breaking people's backs. And we're like, oh, Batman. But it's because he's fighting people like the Joker. And so, yeah, we do let these guys shape who we follow as a hero.
Thank you. Mary.
I think it's interesting that we have Odysseus, who's actually the king of his kingdom, and all of these are people who have authority. Or except for the Joker, but most of them have like civil authority in the government. And kind of it shows our kind of switch from like respecting, authority to like really being very questionable, anxious about authority, given, given the fact that World War II happened, or given like all these kind of governmental corruption things that are so transparent.
All right, thank you. See the hands again. I'm going to move on for the sake of time. But basically, I'm really appreciating you guys' feedback and your perspectives on this. And I think it's really going to help me also in moving forward with my research, as I use specifically Star Wars to look at how we have preserved the tradition of the epic narrative, but have kind of molded it to fit a narrative that more accurately reflects what we deem as good and evil in our world today. In closing, I just want to leave you with this food for thought, just something for you to think about and take home with you for our next discussion. Should we consider more carefully to whom we apply the titles of hero and villain, when some notions of good and evil may not be the same for all people? And should we be more conscious of our own ideals and inclinations when assessing how we perceive certain characters? Thank you for your time, and I look forward to talking with you again.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for staying with me for this long day. My name is Cassandra Hanna with the Department of History at Fisk University. And today we're going to be talking about what I'm calling educational lineages. It's kind of a term I made up, and I'm hoping you'll catch on as we go along. Just a precursor to my presentation, I will be asking some questions. They may be considered personal. Just choose to participate based on what you feel comfortable with. All right, so our objectives for the day. We do have 4. First and foremost, I want to redefine our understanding of education. I want us to separate the historical evolution of education from the contemporary reality of it, and I also want us to place ourselves within this narrative. Lastly, I want us to explore the effects of what took place, essentially.
All right, so this is the first question. By show of hands, how many people know if their grandparents went to high school? Okay. Also, is this in the affirmative? I guess I should clarify. But keep your hands raised. Okay. Keep them raised if they finished high school. And keep them raised if they went on to college. All right. So our hands progressively stayed up and went down throughout this. And my next question for you guys is, why do we think this is? Based on whether it's just a thought that you might have or a conversation you've actually had. I realize that's a privilege we don't all have. So I just want to collect some thoughts from the audience. Sierra?
I think this happened because of opportunity. The opportunities weren't there or made available to them.
Okay.
My family didn't have money.
Yeah, that's real. Tiana?
For me, my great-grandmother went to school and became a teacher, so she really pushed my grandmother to go to school and to go to college.
Yeah, so there was kind of like that generational development. All right, so to speak to this point a little more, I want to talk about universal education. Currently today, students in the United States are expected to go to school K through like 12-ish to an extent. This wasn't always the expectation or understanding. However, it's actually a rather new phenomenon when we're talking about the history of the United States. So while it is like a newer phenomenon, the idea has always been there. Thomas Jefferson, for instance, was pushing for this before the United States was even entirely a country. And he was like big and known for his idea that Virginia should publicly educate all of their children for 3 years. But he intentionally excluded Black people from this idea. This is a quote I have from James Anderson's book. Long title. Anyway, it says, can anyone read it for me actually?
Virginia's peace, prosperity, and civilization depended upon the containment and repression of literacy among its enslaved population.
So this actually goes back to Jefferson's proposal to employ this universal education. He was very intentionally exclusive of Black people, and this is basically why he honestly felt like it was in Virginia's best interest to keep the people without education. While it's a nuanced idea to discuss the Black education in this period, we're actually going to jump forward a little bit and talk about the education that did exist much later in the 19th century. Everyone's favorite, our HBCUs. Yes. So I realize most of the people in this room either attend an HBCU or have at least been in proximity of someone who attends an HBCU for the past month. But I also want to kind of collect what we think an HBCU is. So like, what does that mean? What are our understandings of HBCUs?
I wouldn't say a space that was created to educate newly free people who didn't have another means of higher education or any education.
Yeah, that's a really good one to start with. John?
I think of it as a method of education, one that's grounded in the principle of enriching the mind, body, and soul of the student.
Yeah, I would definitely say Anaya.
I kind of figure out your question, but I think that HBCUs are a hub of social activism and culture creation.
All right. Those are all really good answers. You guys touched on a lot. What's very important to being a historically Black college and university is the historical part. It gets into a lot. So HBCUs are predominantly defined by the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which basically says two things. One, that they were established before the act was signed. Two, that they were established with a specific intent to educate Black Americans. So now that we're all pretty clear on the definitions, it's not just a predominantly Black space. It's not just a space in the South. This is specifically what an HBCU is. Let's talk about kind of what we understand it today versus what we understand of the past. So HBCUs today tend to only offer 2 or 4 year educations like a college curriculum, correct? We're following? All right, so when they were first established, they actually kind of served as like what's sort of a one-stop shop education center. So what that means is you could go there for a primary education all the way up to a graduate education later on at least. Fisk Free Colored School, for instance, opened its doors January 9th, 1866. When it opened, it was educating people ages 7 to 70. Just a small example of what most HBCUs were tasked with doing, because though Black education did exist, it was a little minute in terms of this now newly freed population that was pretty large, pretty extensive, and how could they get a college education without learning how to write their name first? All right, so
like I said, they kind of exist as these multi-centers of education for about a pretty long time. There's separate but equal kind of rules, the South, Jim Crow. So they're not necessarily establishing black high schools or black lower schools up until this point, and it was oftentimes that HBCU served as the only point of these education for miles on end, whether this was in the county or even the whole state at times. Enter Rosenwald schools. So has anyone heard of a Rosenwald school? Naive?
So they were established by a philanthropist, I think he was Jewish, and he just donated schools because he wanted them to be built for black students.
Yeah, so that is Julius Rosenwald, that's who you're talking about. Julius Rosenwald partnered with Booker T. Washington. The way I understand the relationship is Booker T. Washington was kind of like whispering in his ear and got him to establish what's called the Rosenwald Fund. The Rosenwald Fund was largely responsible with establishing educational facilities throughout the United States, not throughout the United States, throughout these 15 states. So it wasn't just schools, it was libraries, it was buildings for universities, homes for teachers, but I primarily want us to focus on the rural school building program, which is perhaps probably the most famous, arguably, arm of the Rosenwald Fund, and specifically the schools, not necessarily Julius Rosenwald or the Rosenwald Fund. I really want us to focus on the schools for the purposes of today's lesson. So what and where? So these schools are kind of important because before they were established, we just talked about the lacking black infrastructure for black education in the South, right? So if you look, you can see over 5,000 schools were created over a dozen states. So even though universal education, we talked about how Thomas Jefferson kind of introduced the idea to an extent. By now, it's 1914. By now, this idea is picking up speed. The progressive movement has been going on for about 30 years. We'll learn about that later, however. So it's been going on for about 30 years, and they're really pushing towards developing a system of education as well. But this system, just like its predecessors, also very exclusive of blacks. Like I said, Plessy versus Ferguson mandates that facilities are separate but equal, aka segregation is the law of the land. But in a lot of these places, they could establish a white high school or a white elementary school and just didn't establish the same for black students. I'm not really sure what the justification was, other than racism and white supremacy, but that's another conversation. So I want to bring our attention in even more to something we can kind of all relate to if we haven't been able to kind of understand these questions or where I've been going this far. Does this name look familiar to anyone at all? Okay, yeah, that's just a coincidence. How does it look any more familiar? Yeah, so this is the school that we visited in Hobson City, Alabama. It was founded in 1923 as the Calhoun County Training School, and it was established by the Rosenwald Fund and the gifts of the community. So Mayor McCourty actually spent a lot of time detailing what this school meant to her and what this school meant to her community. Does anyone care to speak on Anna?
So I know one of the things that she talked about was the fact that like she went to the school K through 12, so it was her entire institution.
Mm-hmm. It was the only school that black people could go to, so even if there weren't black folk in Hobson City, like black folks from other cities had to come to that school because it was the only institution built to teach black folks.
All right, one more, Kayla.
I know that she said that the city hall is in the school now.
Yeah, that's a newer development that we're probably not going to focus as much on, but that also is accurate. It's located behind the school now, which is where we were. So this is the C. Edgar Hanna School, like we've established, and like you guys all said, it was the only black school around, provided her own education K through 12. We all stood in front of her and listened to her tell this story directly to us. So what I kind of want us to understand from this is, while most Rosenwald schools actually do kind of look like this in spirit, they're kind of exist. Some of them are really prominent, other ones are boarded up like this one was. The impact and the legacy of these establishments still impact us very much to this day. So I actually have another question. Are there any of us who are first generation college students? All right, kudos to you. So we just talked about the fact that the Rosenwald School, my bad for not establishing this earlier, but this program was established in 1917 formally. It began in 1914. When I'm asking about our grandparents, I'm also assuming that you guys are on a correct generation of like 20 years per generation. These are things that would impact them and then impact us. So we're all sitting in these seats today, 2019, 100 years later, And the legacy of discrimination in education throughout the United States still very much affects us right now. So, and even if it doesn't affect us directly, we can see how it's affecting our colleagues just in this room. So I want us to think about, if it's affecting us as individuals, how is it affecting these larger systems at work in terms of Black education? Specifically, three of the things that are common issues right now: achievement gaps, where you have the Black students performing disproportionately lower than the white students on the standardized testing and other methods of tracking. The school to prison pipeline that basically says that schools are preparing children for prison more than they're preparing them for life. And also generational wealth. Generational wealth is something that is passed down. You establish a seed for your family to then grow upon and grow upon. And Black families are still working to establish this general foundation. So these are just some things to think about and take away when we gather next week. Thank you, guys. All right, so are there any questions? Oh, I'm sorry.
I don't have a question, but I have a comment. I'm so proud of you on your growth since our first cluster C. So I'm proud of you.
Yes.
All right, Kamara?
In your work, are you gonna focus more so towards HBCUs or like the historically Black high schools, or like a mix of both?
So today I primarily wanted to talk about something that we were less familiar with, just to kind of respect the different backgrounds we come from. But in my work, I'd like to focus about equally on both, because my actual hypothesis is that there's a period in time right around when the Rosenwald Fund was established. A lot of things were also going on with HBCUs, and I tried to fit it into this presentation, and it didn't work. But I'm kind of exploring the different things that are happening with the establishment of this infrastructure for Black education, with the developments at HBCUs, and see how they sort of interrelate and interconnect, and kind of what the legacy of that was, especially on access to education for African Americans. Anyone else? Oh, Asia.
I just want to affirm you for one, because yes, to see us playing, like, I'm proud of your growth, and I know, you know, it's not about your growth.
Yeah.
But I was also just gonna say, so as far as when you look at the relationship between these Black, I'm calling these historically Black high schools,
Yeah.
HBCUs, you talking about lineage. Is there a certain aspect of this relationship that you're trying to uplift?
I guess the productivity of it. Right now, I'm kind of in a place where what I see is that we're saying, like, okay, they established these schools, HBCUs became colleges in like the 4-year sense, and it was good for everybody. But I'm also I think that there's a trend just in the back of my mind where, like, even though you established these schools, what did you establish to get them to the HBCUs? Because they were already there before. They could work their way up to that college degree. Now they just go to the schools and go back out into the county. So that's my idea behind it. Working on it, though. See me in 2 years, though. All right, thank you, guys.